Chapter 1. A Glimpse of the Rockies. Isabella never had much use for frilly lace or delicate silk once she stepped out into the unforgiving wilderness, but here she was, her threadbare dress clinging to her legs like the last remnants of her old life. The delicate fabric flapped around her knees as the wind whipped through the jagged pines of the Rocky Mountains. She pulled her shawl tighter around her shoulders, wincing as the cold bit into her exposed skin. Her boots were caked in mud, her hair tangled from days of restless travel. Still, as she stood at the edge of the precipice, looking out over the vast expanse of snow-capped peaks and sprawling valleys below, she couldn't bring herself to care about much of anything anymore. No one had known where she was going when she fled, least of all her betrothed. Good riddance to him, she thought bitterly. The land baron? Duncan McAllister had made promises that now seemed hollow, like his fair speeches about honor, love, and family. They were nothing more than tools to trap her in a gilded cage. I should have known better, Isabella muttered to herself, the wind carrying her words away. She hadn't run far enough. The weight of her family's tarnished name followed her everywhere, clinging to her like the cold. And she hadn't gotten far enough away from the bastard who'd betrayed her and everything her family had worked for. But, for now, this stretch of mountain was as far from him as she could get. A hawk cried overhead, soaring against the gray morning sky. Its shrill call was a reminder of what she was really running from, the scandal that had ruined her life and her family's legacy. The cold wind snapped at her face, almost like the cruel lash of the past. But she couldn't go back. Not now. Not ever. She wasn't going to be his pawn. Her thoughts drifted to Duncan's face, the way his lips had twisted in that arrogant smirk when he told her she'd never escape, how his grip had tightened on her wrist when she tried to make her case. That day, in the drawing room of the manor, she'd known. She had known that she was nothing more than a pawn in his eyes, that her future had been laid out for her without a thought for what she might want. Not anymore, Isabella whispered fiercely to herself, her breath fogging in front of her. She had a new plan now, a new life if she could survive this harsh land long enough to make it her own. She turned her gaze from the mountains to the small pack resting by her feet. A threadbare shawl, a journal, a few trinkets that had once meant something, and a small sack of dried bread and jerky. It wasn't much, but it had to be enough. She'd survive. The wind shifted, pushing the sleeves of her dress against her forearms as she adjusted her shawl. It was going to be a long journey ahead, but she was no stranger to hardship. She'd grown up with it. The sudden thundering of hooves interrupted her reverie. It was a low rumble at first, but it quickly grew louder, cutting through the stillness like a warning bell. Her head snapped toward the sound. She didn't wait for it to get closer. Great, just great, she muttered under her breath. She reached for the horse's reins, her heart starting to race. No matter how hard she tried, she couldn't escape the world she'd left behind. As the hooves grew louder, Isabella's hand hovered near the knife she'd tucked into her belt. She'd never been one for confrontation, but in this new world, you either stood your ground or you got trampled. She wasn't ready to be trampled yet. The sound of hooves broke through the misty veil, and a dark silhouette emerged from the tree line. A lone rider, his figure tall and broad as he neared. Isabella could tell by the way he sat straight in the saddle, how he held himself, that he was no stranger to the hard life of the West. But what kind of man was he? She narrowed her eyes. His face was hard to make out from this distance, but she could see enough to know he wasn't someone she should trust. Not that she trusted anyone these days. The horse slowed as it drew closer, and Isabella took a step back, her hand still on the knife. The rider slowed as well, his horse snorting and tossing its head. When the man drew near enough for her to see his face, her breath caught in her throat. He was tall, with a broad chest and a jawline that could cut glass. His hair, dark and windblown, framed his face like something out of a bad dream. His eyes, piercing, cold, and calculating, locked onto her as though he were measuring her worth, making her feel like an insect caught in a jar. "Well, now," he drawled, his voice low and smooth with an edge that sent a chill down her spine. "Seems like I found myself a little lost lady in the wilderness." Isabella's hand tightened around the knife. "I'm not lost, thank you very much." The man gave a lazy smile, his lips curling at the edges. No, I suppose not, but I wouldn't be out here alone if I were you. Things can get mighty dangerous in these mountains. Mighty dangerous. I'm not the one who should be worried, she shot back, raising her chin. You've got a long way to go before you catch up with me. He chuckled, low and dark, before he dismounted, his boots crunching on the snow beneath him. He was tall, too tall for comfort, and his approach had a deliberate calmness to it that sent an uneasy twinge through her stomach. Yes, she didn't like that look. She didn't like it one bit. You're running from something, he said, taking slow steps toward her. I can tell, running and hiding, but don't think you can outrun fate, darlin'. Isabella straightened, a stubborn fire lighting in her chest. I don't need fate, and I sure don't need your help. The man stopped a few paces away, his gaze flicking over her in a way that made her feel exposed. I wasn't offering any, he said with a smirk, his eyes glinting. But I'll tell you this, sweetheart, those mountains can be unforgiving. And I'm guessing you're about to find that out the hard way. Her pulse quickened. She didn't want to deal with them, not today. I'm not interested in your advice. He raised an eyebrow. Fair enough, he said, sounding almost amused. But one thing you'll learn out here real quick. There's no such thing as an easy ride in these parts. He turned and mounted his horse again, giving her one last look over his shoulder. Enjoy the view, miss. It's the last peaceful one you're going to get in a long while. With that, he kicked his horse into motion, his figure disappearing into the dense trees, leaving Isabella to stew in the wake of his words. Her heart thudded in her chest, but the wind cut through her anger, cooling the heat in her cheeks. She wasn't afraid. She wasn't about to let some stranger throw her off course, but that didn't mean she wasn't going to keep an eye out. Isabella watched the direction he had gone, the wild mountains stretching endlessly ahead of her, knowing that the road she had chosen would be anything but simple. Isabella kicked her heels into her mare's sides, urging the weary horse into a quicker pace. The dust clung to her skirts, settling like a reminder of everything she was leaving behind. Behind her, the town of Hartsford faded into the distance, a patch of lights twinkling faintly as the twilight deepened. A few distant lanterns flickered in the windows of homes and saloons, but it was the kind of light that felt more like a warning than a welcome. She shifted in the saddle, adjusting the fabric of her dress, which now seemed more hindrance than anything else. She'd lost a good part of the lace-trimmed sleeves after the first few days on the road, and her boots were caked in a layer of mud that only added to the frustration of riding for hours. Still, she pushed forward. The night air was brisk, tinged with the sharp scent of pine and the leather of her saddle. Above, the sky was stretched thin with stars, and the crescent moon hung low on the horizon. The world, vast and empty, seemed to stretch before her like an endless path toward freedom or destruction, if she was honest with herself. She didn't really know where she was going. Not yet. The road she rode was worn and uneven, barely more than a trail beaten into the earth by years of travelers passing through. A lonely stretch of land, far from the more populous settlements. She could feel the weight of the world in every step the horse took. For all her determination to escape the marriage that awaited her, she couldn't quiet the gnawing in her stomach. It wasn't just Duncan McAllister. No, it was the whole life she was running from. The trappings of her past, the expectations that had been placed on her since the day she was born. She tightened her grip on the reins and focused ahead, the clop of hooves and the soft rustling of her skirts the only sounds accompanying her thoughts. A distant whistle broke the quiet. The sudden sound made her jump, and she instinctively looked over her shoulder. A lone figure loomed in the distance, emerging from the trees lining the path. She couldn't see much yet, but it was a figure of a man, tall and broad, walking toward her with purpose. Isabella's heart skipped a beat, and she instinctively pulled the mare to a stop. Easy now, she murmured to the horse, who was already tossing its head nervously, sensing the change in her mood. She straightened her back, tensing as the man drew nearer. Don't worry, miss. Ain't no harm in a fella trying to get some rest. A voice called from the shadows ahead. It was gruff, but there was an easy lilt to it. The man was approaching her with a slow, confident gait, his wide-brimmed hat barely concealing the worn face beneath. Isabella kept her distance. I'm not looking for company, she said firmly. The man chuckled, stepping into the faint glow of the nearby lantern that lit the road ahead. His face came into view, a weathered traveler, rough around the edges, with a day's worth of stubble on his chin and a cigarette dangling from the corner of his mouth. "Coulda fooled me, miss, but I reckon that's none of my business." His eyes flicked down to her horse, and he raised an eyebrow. "You're a bit far from town, aren't you? Not many folks out this way after dark, especially with a nice mare like that." "I'm just passing through," she said, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. The man grunted, taking a drag from his cigarette and leaning against a nearby fence post. Passing through, eh? Don't reckon there's much of a passin' to do on these parts, unless you're looking to get somewhere fast." Isabella narrowed her eyes, her pulse quickening. "I'm not in the mood for games, sir." "Oh, don't fret," the man said, his grin widening. "I'm just trying to be friendly. You look like you've got a heavy heart, that's all." Isabella's grip on the reins tightened, but she forced herself to remain calm. She didn't have the luxury of trusting anyone. "I'm just fine, thank you." The man snorted, but there was something oddly comforting about his chuckle. He took another drag from the cigarette before flicking it onto the ground, grinding it into the dirt with his boot. "Well, I reckon you'd be just fine a lot quicker if you stopped by that inn down the road. Ain't much, but they keep a fire going and it's warm enough for a lady to rest her bones a spell." Isabella didn't respond at first. She didn't want to stop. Didn't want to trust anyone. She had a destination in mind, and it didn't include lingering in some roadside inn with a bunch of strangers. But the man's words stuck with her, nagging at her. She hadn't slept properly in days. Her body ached from the long hours in the saddle. Maybe stopping for just a moment wouldn't hurt. Reluctantly, she nodded. "Where's the inn?" The man smiled knowingly. "Just up ahead. Won't miss it. Don't look like much, but they've got some decent folks running it. Ain't no harm in a warm meal and a bed." As Isabella turned the mare and urged it forward, she heard him murmur under his breath, "Ain't no harm in a little kindness either, miss." The inn wasn't much to look at. Just a simple one-story wooden building, the kind that dotted the frontier. A flickering lantern hung in the window, casting a warm glow onto the dirt road. Inside, the smell of cooking food, something hearty, likely stew, drifted out, teasing her senses. As she entered, the door creaked and a bell chimed faintly overhead. The air was thick with the scent of tobacco and wood smoke, the sound of a crackling fire coming from the hearth. A small group of men sat at the long wooden bar, nursing their drinks, while a couple of women bustled about, tending to the tables. The bartender looked up from polishing a glass, his eyes narrowing when he saw her enter. She stood a moment, unsure of herself, her hand still on the door. "Can I help you, miss?" the bartender asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Isabella hesitated, her stomach grumbling in protest. She hadn't eaten properly in over a day. "Just a room for the night, and perhaps something warm to eat," the bartender nodded and motioned to a table near the back. "I'll get you settled. There's stew on the stove. You look like you could use it." "Thank you," Isabella said quietly, pulling her shawl a little tighter around her shoulders as she made her way toward the table. She took a seat, glancing around the room. Most of the men didn't pay her much mind, though one or two looked up from their drinks with curious eyes. As she sat down, the door swung open again, and a man with a thick beard and a dusted hat entered. He glanced around, his eyes settling on Isabella before he walked to the bar. The bartender waved at him. "Quiet night, Jed." Jed let out a sigh. "Ain't nothing quiet when the wind's blowing like this. Damn dust gets in my throat every time I turn around." "Yeah, but at least we're not stuck out there in it," the bartender replied. Jed grinned. "True enough, but when the wind's blowing, it makes a man think about how little we control out here." Isabella didn't pay them much attention, though the words caught her ear. The thought of control, or lack of it, seemed to echo in her mind, especially after everything she'd left behind. The bartender set a steaming bowl of stew down in front of her, interrupting her thoughts. "There you go, miss. You're safe here for the night." She nodded, her fingers grazing the wooden spoon as she took a tentative sip. The warm broth hit her stomach like a soothing balm, and for a moment she felt the weight of the road lift just a little. From the bar, she heard a voice, a low, gravelly tone, muttered to the bartender. In these parts, even blood can be washed clean by forgiveness. Isabella paused, the spoon hovering near her mouth. The words, simple as they were, struck a chord deep inside her. She didn't know why. Maybe it was because she was tired of running, tired of being the one who had to shoulder the sins of others. Her resolve to reclaim her family's honor felt a little stronger in that moment, though she couldn't yet say what would come of it. She ate in silence, listening to the conversation around her as the fire crackled in the hearth, warming her to the bone. Later, as she slipped out into the cool night, the path ahead was uncertain, but she was certain of one thing. Her journey wasn't just about running away anymore. It was about finding a way to make things right. Chapter 2. The Fateful Encounter. Isabella's mare took each step cautiously, the worn hooves skidding slightly over the loose gravel that coated the narrow trail. She gripped the reins, her knuckles white as the path narrowed, forcing the horse to move along the edge of a sharp drop. The wind howled through the trees, the cold bite of the mountains stinging her face. A muffled clink of the saddle echoed in the quiet as Isabella urged her mare forward, her eyes scanning the treacherous landscape. With every step, the earth felt more unstable, the sense of isolation sinking in. She hadn't seen another soul since leaving the inn hours ago, and the mountains, silent, imposing, seemed to close in around her. She shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, her skirt tugging at her legs with each movement. "Couldn't have made this any harder, could you?" she muttered under her breath, the edges of her words swallowed by the wind. The mare gave a soft snort, as if in agreement. Isabella's stomach churned with unease, not from the cold, but from the uncertainty of her journey. The feeling that she was running in circles, with no real destination in sight, had begun to gnaw at her. She had barely realized how far she'd gone when she heard it, the unmistakable sound of hooves pounding in the distance. At first she thought it might be the echo of her own ride, but the rhythm was too steady, too deliberate. It was a sound that didn't belong to her at all. She turned quickly, her heart skipping a beat. The trail was still empty, just rocks and endless stretches of mountain. But then, through a break in the trees, she saw him, a solitary figure on horseback, his outline cut against the pale sky. He was dressed in a worn duster, the faded brown fabric whipping in the wind, and his hat, battered and sun-bleached, sat low over his face. Isabella couldn't make out his features at first, but there was no mistaking the way he moved. There was confidence in his posture, in the steady rhythm of his horse's steps. As he drew closer, she instinctively tightened her grip on the reins, every muscle in her body tensing. The man didn't appear to be in any hurry. His horse, a sturdy chestnut, moved at a slow, deliberate pace, as if the rider wasn't concerned about the rough terrain. His gaze swept the path ahead, the shadow of his hat obscuring most of his face. But she could tell from the set of his shoulders that he wasn't the sort to be caught off guard. Isabella's heart drummed louder. There was something about the way he moved, something unsettling. He didn't stop until they were within a few feet of each other, his horse sidestepping to avoid the loose rocks that lined the trail. As he slowed to a stop, the man looked up, his eyes sharp and calculating, studying her with a mix of curiosity and caution. "Well, I'll be damned," he muttered under his breath, though he didn't seem particularly surprised. "Didn't think I'd find a lady up here." Isabella's chin lifted, her back straightening despite the unease crawling along her spine. "And what's a man like you doing up here?" The man's lips quirked into a wry smile, and she could see the glint of mischief in his eyes despite the hard edge to his expression. He tipped his hat back slightly, revealing a face roughened by the sun and wind, with deep-set eyes that seemed to see right through her. "Same as you, I suppose," he replied, his voice rough but not unfriendly. "Trying to get somewhere, and I reckon you're lost." "I'm not lost," Isabella shot back quickly, her eyes narrowing. "Just exploring." The man's chuckle was low, amused. "Exploring, huh? On a mountain trail in a dress? You're a brave one." Isabella bristled. She was used to being underestimated, but she didn't appreciate it. "I've been on more dangerous paths than this." "I don't doubt that," he replied with a casual glance over his shoulder as if checking for something behind him. "But I'd watch your step if I were you. These mountains don't take kindly to wanderers, especially ones in fancy dresses. She glanced down at her outfit, and the corners of her mouth twitched. A dress hardly makes me fancy. No? The man raised an eyebrow. Sure looks fancy enough to me. Least for a place like this. She snorted, feeling a bit of the tension in her chest loosen. I've had better company than you, sir. He smiled wider at that, showing a row of teeth that were too white for someone living on the trail. Might have been better company, but you won't find any better than me up here. Unless you're looking for bears, that is. Or worse. Isabella shifted uncomfortably in the saddle, her fingers grazing the hilt of the knife she kept hidden beneath her shawl. I can handle myself just fine. I'm sure you can, he said, as though the words amused him, but it's not the knife you'll need out here. It's good sense, and that's a rare thing in these parts. There was a pause, and for a moment neither of them spoke. The wind picked up again, rustling the trees and tugging at Isabella's skirt. The man studied her for a long moment, his expression unreadable. You're running from something, he said finally, his voice steady and quiet. Isabella's breath hitched, but she forced herself to hold his gaze. And what business is that of yours? The man didn't flinch, just met her eyes with the kind of directness that made her stomach twist. It's my business if it's going to get me killed. Isabella didn't know if he meant it as a threat or a warning, but either way, she wasn't about to back down. She shifted in the saddle, ready to move on. You're quite the conversationalist for a man who's alone, she said, trying to sound more confident than she felt. I imagine you're used to more solitude than company. His lips twitched again, and there was a hint of something more dangerous in the way his eyes softened. I'm used to a lot of things. Doesn't mean I can't recognize a woman who's running from something. Maybe I'm not running at all, Isabella retorted. Maybe I'm just finding my own way. Maybe. His gaze held hers for a moment longer, as though considering whether to press further. Instead, he nodded toward the trail ahead. Well, it's a long road ahead. Better get going if you're planning on finding anything out here. She hesitated, then gave a slight nod. I will. He tipped his hat, his eyes never leaving hers. Don't say I didn't warn you. With that, he turned his horse and kicked it into motion, his duster fluttering like a shadow in the fading light. She watched him disappear down the winding path, the sound of his horse's hooves growing faint as he vanished into the distance. Isabella exhaled sharply and urged her own mare forward. The encounter had left her with more questions than answers. But one thing was clear. The path she was on wasn't just about finding freedom. It was about facing the consequences of running. And something told her that Wyatt, the man she'd just met, would be part of those consequences, whether she liked it or not. Isabella's mare slowed to a cautious trot as she navigated the rocky path, the terrain growing more uneven the further she rode. The wind bit at her cheeks, making her squint against the oncoming gusts. She hadn't seen another soul since early morning, and part of her wondered whether that was a blessing or a curse. The path ahead curved sharply, the narrow trail flanked by jagged cliffs on one side and a deep ravine on the other. She guided the horse carefully, her fingers tight around the reins. One wrong move, one slip, and she could be plummeting down that ravine. Her thoughts were interrupted by the unmistakable sound of hooves, a fast approach like a thundering storm. Damn it, Isabella muttered, her heart leaping into her throat as she jerked on the reins, trying to steer her mare to the edge of the trail. But it was too late. The rider, barely visible through the rising dust, was coming straight toward her. There was no room to avoid him. She instinctively spurred her horse forward, hoping to clear the path, but the rider's horse veered with a wild snort, sending both animals skidding toward the edge of the ravine. Whoa! Isabella shouted, her heart racing as she fought for control. The two horses nearly collided, their hooves scraping against the stone, a collision that sent a shock through Isabella's spine. For a moment, she thought they were both going over the edge, but somehow, by sheer luck, they both came to a grinding halt. Watch where you're going, she hissed, glaring at the rider, her heart still hammering in her chest. The man atop the other horse didn't flinch, his eyes locking with hers as he reined in his steed, a glint of amusement flickering in the depths of his sharp blue eyes. He was tall, broad-shouldered, with a face weathered by the sun and a jawline as hard as the mountains around them. His dark hair was untamed beneath a weather-worn hat, and his lips twitched upward in a half-smile. Seems like you're the one who ought to be watching where you're going, darlin', he drawled, his voice rough but not unfriendly. Isabella's fingers tightened around the reins. I'm not the one who nearly ran me off this mountain, she snapped, trying to steady herself and her horse. And I suggest you show a little more caution next time. The man's smile widened as he swung his leg over his horse, dismounting with a casual grace that made it look easy. He planted his boots firmly on the ground, his gaze never leaving hers. I suppose I should apologize. Didn't see you coming around that bend. I've been known to be a bit preoccupied with my own survival on these trails. Isabella huffed, her temper flaring. I'm not looking for apologies, just some peace and quiet, if you don't mind. The man raised a brow, a glint of amusement flashing in his eyes. Ain't much peace to be had in these mountains, but I reckon you already know that, don't you? Her chin lifted in defiance. I'm not here for conversation. Well, I'm not here to make friends either, he replied, his tone casual, yet there was an underlying edge to his words. But you're right about one thing. This path's dangerous, especially when folks aren't paying attention. Isabella stared at him, eyes narrowing. And what business do you have on this path? The man's lips curved into a wry smile as he took a step closer, leaning on his horse with one arm casually folded across his chest. Just passing through. Same as you, I reckon. This mountain doesn't care who's walking it. Leastwise, not unless they're in too much of a hurry. Isabella wasn't sure why she felt the need to justify her presence, but the question nagged at her. I'm on my way to find some answers. He studied her for a moment as if weighing her words before giving a slight nod. Ain't that the way of things? Always looking for answers in places where there aren't any. But if you think you'll find 'em in these parts, you've got another thing comin'. Isabella's jaw clenched. You've been here long enough to know that, have you? He gave a short laugh, long enough to know when a trail's too rocky for a lady to be riding alone. I'm hardly a lady to be coddled, she shot back, her gaze sharp. His eyes flickered with amusement, then softened into something else, something less teasing, more curious. That's so. Before she could respond, the ground beneath their horses shifted, the rocks crumbling loose as the animals snorted, uneasy on their footing. The man's horse suddenly skittered to the side, one hoof slipping dangerously close to the edge of the ravine. Easy now, boy, the man muttered, his voice low but calm. Without thinking, Isabella spurred her mare forward. Grab the reins, she shouted. The man's horse took another wild step sideways, and before she knew it, both horses were slipping toward the edge. A flash of panic surged through Isabella's chest, but instinct took over. She spurred her horse forward with all the strength she could muster, pulling her mare toward the other rider and grabbing the reins of his horse in one swift motion. The two horses stumbled together in the narrow space, their hooves scraping against the rocks as they tried to regain balance. Hold on, Isabella gritted her teeth, both hands gripping the reins. You need to back up, slowly. For a moment, neither of them moved, frozen in the precarious position. The wind howled louder, as if mocking their struggle. Then, with one final strained tug, the man yanked on his reins, easing the horse back onto the safer ground. Good God, he muttered, his voice steady but laced with tension. He didn't move from his horse at first, only exhaled a deep breath. Isabella took a step back, her heart still thudding in her chest. Well, she said, trying to sound unbothered, that was close. The man chuckled under his breath, wiping his brow with one sleeve. Guess you're a better rider than I thought, though I don't think I'll ever let you talk me into that maneuver again. Isabella shot him a look, feeling her heartbeat slow. I didn't exactly sign up for this either. The man smiled, though it was more weary than playful now. Guess that makes two of us. The tension lingered for a beat longer, and then, with a slight nod, the man pulled his horse back a few paces. Well, I'll be on my way now. Looks like we've both got somewhere to go. Best we don't make it harder than it has to be. Isabella hesitated. Her heart still beat a little faster than it should, and though part of her wanted to be rid of him, another part couldn't help but wonder if this meeting was some kind of twisted fate. You're not sticking around? She asked, a touch of curiosity in her voice. He gave her a look that was part grin, part challenge. I don't much like staying where I'm not wanted. And with that, He turned, guiding his horse back toward the path ahead. Isabella watched him go, the sound of his horse's hooves gradually fading into the distance. She stood there for a moment longer, her mind buzzing with thoughts of what had just transpired. Was it coincidence, or was it destiny? She couldn't say. But one thing was certain, she hadn't seen the last of Wyatt. And for better or worse, neither had he. Chapter 3. Trust on the Edge. The sun had barely slipped below the horizon when they found the overhang, a sheltered nook in the mountainside, where the jagged rock provided just enough cover from the wind. Isabella had barely dismounted when she spotted Wyatt leaning against the craggy wall, his silhouette outlined by the dying light. The tension between them had thickened ever since the narrow escape on the trail, but now, in the eerie quiet of the mountain pass, it felt like something had to give. "I thought I made myself clear earlier," Isabella said, her voice tight, her hands still gripping the reins of her mare. "I'm not interested in company, especially from someone like you." Wyatt glanced up at her, the shadow of a smirk playing at the corner of his lips. He didn't bother straightening his posture, just casually crossed his arms over his chest. "Well, darlin', that's mighty kind of you to say. But I didn't exactly invite myself into your company, now did I?" She narrowed her eyes, feeling her frustration simmer just below the surface. "Then why have you been following me, Wyatt?" He sighed, the sound carrying a mix of irritation and something else, something deeper, that she couldn't quite place. "I ain't following you. Then what do you call it?" Isabella shot back, her voice biting. "Every time I turn around, there you are, lurking in the shadows, acting like you're some sort of guardian angel. I don't need your help." Wyatt took a long, slow breath, the kind of exhale that told her this wasn't a new argument for him. His gaze was steady, unwavering, but there was something else lurking behind his eyes. A flicker of discomfort. "Look, lady, I'm just passing through. I've got my own reasons for being out here, and they don't have a damn thing to do with you." She folded her arms, trying to keep her voice steady, but it wavered slightly. "Then why didn't you just ride on past me earlier? Why didn't you leave me alone?" His eyes softened for a brief second before he caught himself, shaking his head. "Ain't that simple. There's things you don't know. Things I don't plan on explaining." Isabella's pulse quickened, her anger flaring as she took a step closer. "You've got a lot of secrets, don't you? I don't trust men with secrets." Wyatt's jaw clenched and he pushed himself off the wall. He was close now, close enough that she could see the strain in the muscles of his neck. "And I don't trust women who think they know everything," he muttered under his breath, his words tinged with bitterness. "You don't know what it's like out here. You don't know what it's like to walk these trails with blood on your hands." The words hung between them, heavy and unresolved. Isabella's breath caught in her throat, but she didn't let it show. Instead, she gave him a hard look, unwilling to show weakness. "And what, you think you're the only one who's ever had a hard life? You think I haven't had my share of trouble?" Wyatt looked at her for a long moment, his eyes unreadable, before he turned away, walking a few paces to the edge of the overhang. "I didn't say that." She didn't know why she followed him, but she did. "Then why are you still here?" she asked, her voice quieter this time. He turned, looking her dead in the eye, his face grim. "Because you're not the only one on a path to nowhere, lady." Isabella stared at him, her heart pounding. She wasn't sure what kind of response she was expecting, but this was unexpected. For a brief moment, she caught a glimpse of something in his eyes, a flicker of vulnerability, a man who had seen too much and said too little. But before she could process it, the sound of snapping twigs broke the moment, followed by low growls in the distance. Wyatt's posture instantly changed. His hand went to the gun at his hip, his eyes scanning the surrounding rocks. "Stay close," he ordered, his voice now a low command, sharp and alert. Isabella froze. "What is it?" "A pack of wild dogs," Wyatt muttered, his eyes narrowing. "Damn things have been tracking us for a while." She could hear them now, low, growling, the rustling of the underbrush as the pack moved closer. Her pulse raced. She had heard stories of wild dogs in the mountains, but she never thought she'd be the one to face them. The realization sent a shiver down her spine. Wyatt glanced at her, his jaw set. Stay behind me. You've got a knife, right? Isabella nodded, though she was far from confident. She had her knife, but she wasn't sure how much good it would do against a pack of hungry dogs. He gave a sharp nod, his eyes flicking toward the rocks above them. I'll take the lead. When they get close enough, you stick close, and we'll use the terrain to keep them at bay. Before she could protest, he motioned for her to follow. The tension between them evaporated, replaced by the cold necessity of survival. They scrambled to position themselves near the rocky overhang, Wyatt's every movement precise, calculated. Isabella's heart thudded in her chest, but she obeyed his orders, her hand tightening around the knife as she prepared herself for what was to come. The growling grew louder, closer. Wyatt's eyes scanned the shadows, and Isabella felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. The dogs were close. Too close. Suddenly they appeared. 4 of them, their eyes glowing in the fading light. They circled, snarling, their teeth flashing in the dim light. Wyatt raised his rifle and took a shot at the closest dog. The sound of the shot echoed in the valley, sending the pack into a frenzy. Isabella gasped as the closest dog lunged. Without thinking, she swung the knife at the creature, missing it by mere inches. The dog dodged and snapped at her, its jaws closing around the air where her arm had just been. "Damn it, hold on!" Wyatt shouted, firing again. This time, the bullet found its mark, and one of the dogs went down with a yelp. The rest of the pack hesitated for a moment, but then, as if on cue, they charged. Wyatt fired again, but the remaining dogs kept coming. Isabella's heart raced as she ducked behind a rock, her pulse pounding in her ears. She had no time to think. Her hands moved on instinct, the knife gripped tight. Another dog lunged. She didn't hesitate this time, plunging the blade deep into its side. The creature yelped and retreated, blood staining the earth beneath it. Wyatt shot once more, and the last dog fell, its body thudding against the ground with a final, defeated growl. Silence followed. Isabella was still panting, her breath coming in sharp gasps. The adrenaline surged in her veins, leaving her shaky and breathless. Wyatt stood over the fallen pack, his rifle still in hand. He lowered it slowly, his eyes flicking to her. "You did good," he muttered. Isabella didn't know what to say, so she just nodded. She wasn't sure whether to be proud or terrified, but at least they were alive. For now. "We're not out of the woods yet," Wyatt added, his voice low and wary. "Stay close, and next time, don't swing your knife like you're trying to cut a loaf of bread." Isabella gave him a tired smirk, the tension slowly ebbing away. "Maybe next time I'll leave the knife work to you, cowboy." He just grunted, wiping the sweat off his brow. "Wouldn't be a bad idea." They stood there for a moment longer, the silence stretching between them. Despite the earlier tension, despite everything, they both knew the truth. If they were going to survive the mountains, they'd have to trust each other, even if it was just a little bit. The fragile bond between them had been forged in fire, and whether either of them liked it, that trust would have to be enough. For now. The dust had barely settled from the ambush when Isabella found herself standing beside Wyatt again. The tension between them was as thick as the smoke rising from the fire he'd just started, but neither of them seemed eager to break the silence. The night was quiet now, except for the occasional creak of a wagon wheel and the distant howling of wolves. Echoes of a world that seemed far too big for 2 people who barely knew each other. Wyatt sat down on a log, cleaning his rifle with slow, deliberate movements. Isabella remained standing, her arms crossed, eyes fixed on the horizon. She couldn't shake the feeling that this meeting, this reluctant alliance, wasn't just some random twist of fate. It felt calculated, and that thought made her uneasy. "Well," Wyatt finally said, his voice breaking the stillness, "looks like we both survived thanks to your knife skills." Isabella gave him a sharp glance, but didn't respond. Instead, she took a breath, steadying herself. "I didn't ask for your help back there." Wyatt's lips curled at the edges. "Ain't nobody asked for it, but sometimes it's just the way things go, lady." The silence hung between them again, but this time it wasn't as uncomfortable. They were both caught in their own thoughts, each weighing the risk of traveling with the other. Isabella shifted her weight, glancing at her horse, the animal tethered nearby. She felt the familiar tug of independence. It was the one thing that had kept her sane through years of forced decisions and expectation. But now she had to admit that survival meant cooperation, at least for the time being. "Fine," she said finally, her voice quieter now. "I'll travel with you, but it's temporary. Don't get any ideas about me trusting you." Wyatt didn't look up, but his lips quirked in the same half-smile that had been both infuriating and intriguing all at once. "I'm not in the business of trust, darlin'." He paused, glancing up at her with a raised eyebrow. "I figure we both have our reasons for not trustin' people." That was the closest thing to honesty he'd offered yet. Isabella's thoughts flickered to the betrayal she had fled from. The lies and the empty promises from a man who had never truly cared. But she shoved those thoughts aside. She wasn't here to dwell on her past. She had a future to carve out. "Good," she said, her voice hardening once more. "Then we're agreed." Without another word, they turned their attention to the trail ahead. The wilderness stretched out before them like an untamed beast, vast, wild, and full of hidden dangers. The air was cool, the biting wind tugging at their clothes as they urged their horses forward. Hours passed in silence. The terrain shifted from rocky outcrops to sweeping grasslands, the wind howling through the open space, making Isabella's eyes water. She couldn't help but admire the raw beauty of the land, its sheer, untamed nature. But there was also something intimidating about it. It made her feel small, insignificant. "You ever been out here before?" she called out, the words cutting through the silence. Wyatt glanced over at her, his face unreadable. "A few times," he replied, his voice gruff. "This part of the country's got its own way of taking you by surprise." Isabella nodded, feeling the weight of his words. There was no denying that the wilderness was a law unto itself. Out here, people were nothing more than specks on the land, and the land didn't care whether you lived or died. As they continued down the narrow trail, the sun dipped lower, casting long shadows across the plains. Isabella's stomach rumbled, reminding her that she hadn't eaten since breakfast. "We should make camp before it gets dark," she suggested, her voice practical. She didn't relish the idea of sitting down to eat with Wyatt, but the alternative, riding in the dark, wasn't much better. Wyatt nodded, pulling his horse to a halt. "Fine by me, let's find a spot with some cover." They rode a little farther until they came across a small glen nestled between two hills. The ground was soft, a few low trees offering some shelter from the wind. Wyatt swung off his horse, landing with a quiet thud. He untied the reins and began gathering firewood. Isabella, still on her horse, hesitated. "I can gather some wood if you'd like." Wyatt shot her a sideways glance. "I reckon you'd be better off looking after your horse. Don't want it wandering off in the night, do we?" "Fine," Isabella replied, irritation flaring, but she didn't argue. She dismounted and tied her mare to a nearby tree, taking a moment to pet its mane and soothe it after the long ride. As she worked, Wyatt set up the campfire, pulling out a few strips of dried meat from his pack. He glanced over his shoulder, the quiet flicker of the firelight reflecting in his eyes. "Don't suppose you have anything better than that dry bread in your bag?" Isabella arched an eyebrow. "You think I carry gourmet meals in my saddlebags?" Wyatt grinned, a flash of teeth. "A girl can dream, can't she?" She rolled her eyes, but the banter, however light, felt like a small bridge between them. The fire crackled as she unpacked a tin plate, the wind rustling the leaves of the trees around them. As night fell, they sat across from each other, the fire casting flickering shadows over their faces. The silence stretched, but it wasn't uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that came from two people who were too tired to fill the gaps with anything but their own thoughts. Finally, Isabella broke the stillness. "I've been running from a life I never wanted," she said softly, her voice almost lost in the crackle of the fire. Wyatt didn't look up, but she could feel his attention shift toward her. "What life's that?" She stared into the flames, her mind drifting back to the days before she had left. "I was promised to a man I didn't choose. Duncan McAllister, a man with more ambition than sense. My father thought it was a good match. I thought I could make it work. But when I found out what he was really like, when I found out what he was willing to do to get what he wanted, there was no turning back." She paused, the weight of the memories pressing down on her. "I couldn't stay. I wouldn't." Wyatt's gaze remained fixed on the fire, his expression unreadable. but there was something in his silence that made her feel less alone. "What about you?" Isabella asked after a moment, the question slipping from her mouth before she could stop it. "What's your story?" Wyatt exhaled slowly, his voice quieter now. "Ain't much to tell. Born in a place much like this, grew up too fast, learned how to survive too quick, got myself into a heap of trouble. Some things you can't undo, no matter how hard you try." She didn't press him for more. She knew what it was like to have your past weigh heavy on you, too heavy to speak of. She let the silence fall again, and for once it wasn't filled with distrust, it was just shared. As the fire burned low, Isabella pulled her blanket tighter around her shoulders, leaning back against the ground. Wyatt sat a little farther away, his eyes scanning the darkness beyond their small circle of light. "I'll take the first watch," he said, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. Isabella nodded, too tired to argue. As she closed her eyes, she let the sound of the wind in the trees and the crackling of the fire lull her into a restless sleep. She didn't know what lay ahead, didn't know if trusting Wyatt was a mistake or the only choice she had, but for tonight, it was enough that they had survived together. Tomorrow they would face the wilderness once again, and maybe, just maybe, they would survive it. Chapter 4. Subtle Clues and Foreshadowing. Isabella sat by the fire, the flickering flames casting dancing shadows across her face as she absent-mindedly turned the locket over in her hands. The cool metal gleamed in the firelight, its once shiny surface now dull from the wear of days in her pocket. She had held it 100 times since she left, and yet every time she looked at it, she felt a little more disconnected from the life it had once represented. Wyatt sat a few feet away, his back against a tree, staring into the fire. He had said little since they sat down to eat, and Isabella had chosen to keep her thoughts to herself, letting the silence settle over them. She didn't need to explain everything about the locket. He wasn't the sort to ask. But even so, she couldn't shake the feeling that it was more than just a token of her family's past. There was something in the engraving, something she couldn't quite make sense of, but that kept nagging at her. Her fingers traced the edges of the locket, the intricate filigree design. At first glance, it seemed like just an ornate piece of jewelry, but the closer she looked, the more she realized there was a pattern. No, a symbol, carefully hidden in the delicate curves of the design. She squinted, turning it over in her hand to catch the light just right. "What's that?" Wyatt's voice broke through the quiet, catching her off guard. She looked up quickly, startled by the sound of his voice. Wyatt hadn't moved from his position, but his eyes were locked on her hand, fixed on the locket with an intensity that made her stomach flutter uneasily. For a moment, she wondered if he'd seen something in the engraving, something she hadn't noticed. I don't know," she said quickly, her voice betraying a tinge of uncertainty. "It's just part of the design." Wyatt didn't answer right away. His gaze remained on the locket, and for the briefest of moments, his eyes flickered with a look she couldn't quite place. Something like recognition, but not quite. "What is it you're running from, anyway?" he asked, his voice low but steady. Isabella frowned, her grip tightening on the locket. "I'm not running from anything," she said sharply, then softened her tone. "I'm running to something, if that makes any sense." Wyatt shifted, his eyes never leaving the locket as if it held some unspoken answer to his unasked questions. "Does it?" he muttered under his breath, but then shook his head, as if pushing the thought away. Before she could respond, he stood up suddenly, brushing the dust off his pants. He seemed to need something to occupy his mind, his gaze flitting across the camp with a vague sort of restlessness. Isabella tucked the locket back into her coat pocket, the weight of it feeling heavier than it had before. She didn't like how Wyatt had looked at it, or at her. She didn't trust the flicker of recognition she had seen in his eyes. And there it was again, that feeling creeping into her chest. She was beginning to think that, like so many things, the truth behind the locket wasn't something she could escape from. A sharp crack broke the silence as Wyatt tossed another log onto the fire, sending sparks flying into the air. "You ever think about what's next?" he asked, his voice gruff as he settled back down by the fire. "Not just what you're running from, but what you're aiming for." Isabella shifted uncomfortably on her rock. The truth was, she hadn't given much thought to what lay ahead. The uncertainty of it all was as dizzying as it was terrifying. "I'm figuring that out," she said quietly, her voice almost lost in the whisper of the wind. There was a pause. Wyatt didn't press her for more, but his gaze softened just a touch. Maybe, just maybe, he was starting to understand that there were things even a woman like her couldn't say out loud. The fire crackled as the wind howled through the trees, sending a shiver through Isabella's bones. The night was closing in and the shadows grew longer, but she couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. Then, as though the wilderness itself was listening to her unease, a distant sound reached her ears. A low, eerie howl echoed through the night, followed by the faintest rustle of leaves. Isabella stiffened, her heart rate quickening. It was no coyote's cry. It was too low, too primal. Wyatt was already on his feet, rifle in hand. His gaze darted toward the noise. "Stay close," he said, his tone now sharp, authoritative. "That wasn't no wolf." Isabella's heart pounded as she stood up, her hand instinctively brushing the knife at her waist. The sound was coming closer now, almost like the wind was carrying it straight to them. Another howl pierced the air, followed by the snapping of twigs in the distance. "You think it's the dogs again?" she asked, her voice low and cautious. "No," Wyatt answered tersely, his eyes narrowing. "Wolves are bad enough, but this sounds like something else." The wind picked up again, carrying the scent of pine and something else. Something wild, something dangerous. Wyatt's eyes met hers for a split second, a silent understanding passing between them. They'd both heard it now, and neither of them was going to take any chances. Without another word, they moved quickly to gather their gear. Isabella secured her knife, and Wyatt checked his rifle once more before slipping it into his coat. There was no telling how close the danger was, but both of them knew one thing for certain. They weren't about to be caught off guard. The howls grew louder, more insistent. Isabella's breath hitched in her chest as her eyes scanned the dark horizon. She didn't know what was out there, but she knew one thing. It wasn't friendly. Wyatt caught her eye as he mounted his horse. "If it's what I think it is, we need to move. Fast." "Agreed," Isabella said, her voice barely above a whisper. The horses were already restless, their ears twitching at the sounds of the night. Wyatt gave a sharp nod, and without waiting for a response, he spurred his horse into motion. Isabella followed suit, urging her mare forward as they rode toward the rocky terrain just beyond the camp. With each step, the sounds grew nearer, until they seemed to be coming from all directions. Something was closing in, and both of them knew they had no time to waste. Wyatt glanced over his shoulder, his face grim. "Get ready," he said quietly. "Whatever it is, we're going to have to fight it off." The fire was dying behind them, but the night was alive with the sounds of something far more dangerous. In that fleeting moment, Isabella knew she had no choice but to trust Wyatt, at least for now. The wilderness had no patience for people who couldn't depend on each other. As they rode toward the uncertain darkness, Isabella couldn't shake the feeling that this night would change everything. She didn't know if it would be the wolves or the mystery behind the locket or even Wyatt's past that would catch up with them first, but she knew that the truth was out there, lurking, waiting to be uncovered. The crackling of the campfire was the only sound that broke the silence as the first light of morning spilled across the frost-laden ground. Isabella sat with her arms wrapped tightly around her knees, staring at the orange glow of the fire. The warmth of the flames contrasted with the sharp bite of the cold that still hung in the air. She could see her breath in the stillness of the dawn, a soft puff of white disappearing into the wilderness around her. Wyatt stirred beside her, his movements slow, deliberate as he tended to the fire. He had risen early, as always, the routine of survival etched into his every motion. His dark eyes, still half-lidded from the night's rest, glinted with the quiet sharpness of someone who never let his guard down, even in the early hours when the world seemed to be taking a deep breath. A pot of coffee simmered on the fire, the rich aroma filling the cold morning air. Wyatt didn't say anything as he worked, but she could feel his presence beside her, the unspoken acknowledgement that they were both here together in this moment. Isabella took a deep breath, her mind racing. It was still hard to trust him, hard to allow someone so close after everything she'd been through, but the journey had a way of eroding those walls little by little. She looked down at her hands, the fingers stiff from the cold, and then at the locket resting in the folds of her coat. It was always there, always reminding her of what she had lost and what she was still fighting for. You ever thought about what you're doing out here? Wyatt's voice broke into her thoughts, quiet but heavy with the weight of the question. His eyes met hers, his face unreadable but his tone softening for once. Isabella looked up, startled by the question. She hadn't expected him to ask. She shifted uncomfortably. "I'm just trying to survive," she replied, a little too quickly. "Isn't that enough?" Wyatt raised an eyebrow, the corner of his mouth twitching upward in something like amusement. "Surviving, huh? That's all you're after?" "Why not?" she shot back, pulling her blanket tighter around her shoulders. "What else is there?" Wyatt studied her for a moment, the firelight flickering in his dark eyes. "You think that's what you're really after, just surviving?" She didn't answer right away. Instead, she stared into the fire, the flames dancing like the ghosts of her past, flickering and twisting in the warmth. "Maybe I don't know what I'm after," she admitted quietly. "But I can't go back. Not to the life I left." Wyatt's gaze softened for a moment, and he nodded slowly. "Ain't no going back for most of us." He exhaled deeply, his eyes drifting to the horizon as if lost in thought. "Guess we just keep moving forward, even if we don't know where we're headed." Isabella glanced at him, her expression unreadable. "What about you? You seem to have some idea, some plan?" Wyatt chuckled softly, the sound rough and weary. "If you can call it a plan," he muttered. "I'm just trying to keep my head down. There's no end to the trouble I've found out here. Some people don't get to make a choice, and I reckon I'm one of them." The conversation drifted, an uneasy silence hanging between them as the fire crackled and popped. She couldn't help but feel the weight of his words, but something in her gut told her there was more to him than just the words he said. There was a shadow in his voice, a quiet regret, something he wasn't saying. Wyatt shifted, reaching for his coffee with a hand that still bore the calluses of a life spent in the wilderness. "You don't seem the type to just survive, Isabella," he said after a long pause, his tone softer now, almost contemplative. "You're tougher than that." Isabella frowned, unsure of how to respond. "Tough doesn't always mean strong," she replied, her voice tinged with bitterness. "Sometimes it just means you've learned how to hide your weakness." Wyatt met her gaze for a moment, his eyes sharp. "And what are you hiding, then?" he asked quietly, his voice cutting through the stillness like a blade. She flinched, but the answer was there, buried beneath layers of pride and pain. "My past," she murmured. "The family I came from. The life I was supposed to have. It's not something I can escape. Not really." Wyatt's lips pressed into a thin line as he set his coffee cup down. "Seems to me like you're doing a hell of a job running from it." "I'm not running," Isabella said, her voice firm despite the flicker of doubt she couldn't entirely suppress. "I'm just getting away from everything that tried to force me into a life I didn't want." The tension between them hung thick, but something in Wyatt's expression softened just enough to let a crack through the hard exterior. "We've all got things we can't escape, no matter how far we go." Isabella's heart gave a small, painful twist. She knew exactly what he meant, but she couldn't say it out loud, not yet. She wasn't ready to confront the pieces of her past she had locked away. After a long pause, she changed the subject. "What's the deal with that locket?" Wyatt's eyes flickered with recognition, and for the briefest moment, she saw something like regret flash across his features. He didn't answer immediately, instead letting the fire crackle between them. Finally, he shrugged. "Just a piece of jewelry, I suppose. But I've seen that symbol before." Isabella froze. "What symbol?" Wyatt hesitated before speaking. "The engraving on the back. I'm not sure, but I've seen it before. Somewhere. Can't say where exactly." Isabella's pulse quickened. "What do you mean?" Wyatt turned his head slightly, his face hardening again, as if he regretted mentioning it at all. "I mean, it's not something you see every day." The fire crackled louder between them, and Isabella felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold morning air. She wanted to press him, ask him more about the symbol, but Something in his eyes told her he wouldn't give up any answers without a fight. For a long while they sat in silence. The crackling of the fire seemed too loud now, and the wind that had carried their conversation away before was now a distant hum. Her mind was racing with questions, but Wyatt's silence kept her from asking more. She looked at him, trying to decipher what was hidden behind his guarded eyes. His posture was stiff, the hard line of his jaw betraying some inner turmoil he hadn't voiced. "I'll ask you again," she said softly, leaning forward, her voice steady. "What's the deal with the locket?" Wyatt's lips thinned, and for a moment Isabella thought he might say nothing at all. But then his eyes flicked to hers, and for the briefest of moments, she saw the ghost of something else. Something he wasn't ready to share. "Maybe it's better if you don't know," he muttered, his voice low. The words hung in the air between them, heavy with unspoken truths. Before she could respond, a sudden sound shattered the stillness of the morning, a distant rustling, followed by a growl. The hairs on the back of her neck stood up, and Wyatt's hand was already reaching for his rifle. Something was out there. Something that had been waiting in the shadows. Isabella's heart pounded as she looked toward the darkening woods, the firelight flickering in her eyes. The tension of their conversation was forgotten, replaced by the sharp sting of danger. Wyatt was already on his feet, his rifle trained in the direction of the sound. "Stay low, don't make a sound." Isabella nodded, her body tensed, every instinct screaming that whatever was coming was more than just a passing threat. The night wasn't over, not by a long shot, and neither was the mystery behind the locket. Isabella sat cross-legged by the fire, poking the embers with a stick, as Wyatt stirred the pot over the low flames. The air had cooled significantly as the sun dipped behind the mountains, but the warmth from the fire was enough to keep the chill at bay. The stew was thick, hearty, and filling, and though neither of them said much as they ate, it was clear they were both thankful for the small comforts of the evening. "Not half bad for a meal cooked over an open fire," Isabella remarked, her mouth full of the salty stew. Wyatt smirked, glancing at her from over the rim of his bowl. "I've had worse." She raised an eyebrow. "I don't think I'd want to hear about the worst meals you've eaten." He chuckled, setting his bowl down and wiping his mouth with the back of his hand. "I wouldn't be so quick to judge. Some of the best meals are the ones you never see coming. When you're out in the wild, you don't exactly get to be picky." Isabella couldn't help but smile despite herself. There was something about his easygoing attitude that made her want to challenge him, but in a way that felt more like teasing than any real animosity. "You'd eat anything if it meant staying alive, wouldn't you?" she said, leaning back slightly, eyeing him with amusement. Wyatt met her gaze, his lips curling at the corners. "I reckon that's a fair assessment, but I've learned that survival ain't just about the food, it's the little things, too." Isabella thought about that for a moment, absently stirring her stew as the fire crackled softly. It was one of those nights where the world felt small. Just her, Wyatt, and the stars above. The night felt like it was full of possibility, but the silence between them carried a weight that neither of them was willing to ignore for long. "Do you think we ever really get to leave the past behind?" she asked quietly, her voice softer than usual. The question had been sitting in her mind for days, and now that she'd spoken it aloud, it seemed to hang in the air like smoke. Wyatt paused, his expression unreadable as he turned his attention back to the fire. "You running from your past, Isabella?" Her hand tightened around her bowl as she avoided his gaze. "I'm not running. I'm trying to move forward." He didn't respond immediately, but she felt the weight of his scrutiny. "Same thing," he said finally, his voice rough but steady. Isabella looked up at him, surprised by the rawness in his tone. "You think it's the same thing?" Wyatt met her eyes, his face set with a kind of quiet resolve. "It's the same damn thing if you're trying to outrun something you can't change. Ain't nobody can escape their past. Not for long." She stared into the fire, letting his words sink in. "You're right," she murmured. "But that doesn't mean we have to keep carrying it around like a weight." "I'm not sure I know how to let go of it." Wyatt shifted, stretching his legs out in front of him. "Ain't nobody said it was easy. But I reckon we all got things we'd rather forget." Isabella nodded slowly, the pain from the memories she'd tried so hard to bury surfacing again. She glanced at Wyatt, wondering if he too carried the same kind of weight she did. There was something in his eyes, something that hinted at a past full of regrets and secrets. "Do you ever think about what you've done?" she asked, her voice hesitant. "About what you've left behind?" Wyatt's jaw tightened, and for a moment Isabella was sure he would shut her out like he had so many times before. But instead, he leaned forward, his elbows resting on his knees. "Every day," he said quietly, his voice rough. "I think about it more than I care to admit." She swallowed, her own heart pounding in her chest. "What happens when you can't forgive yourself?" Wyatt was silent for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the flames. "I don't know if I can forgive myself, Isabella," he said, his voice low as if the weight of his words was too much for him to carry. Some things you just can't make right, no matter how hard you try." The words stung in a way she hadn't expected, but there was something oddly comforting in them too. It was the truth. Raw and unfiltered, they both knew it. And for the first time, she felt like he was letting her in, letting her see the pain he carried with him. Isabella glanced at him, her voice almost a whisper. "But if you don't forgive yourself, how can you move on?" Wyatt's eyes flickered toward her, and for a moment she thought he might say something more, but instead he just shook his head. "I don't know," he muttered. "I guess you just keep moving, even if you don't have all the answers." The fire crackled between them, the weight of his words settling into the stillness. Isabella stared at the embers, the warmth of the fire seeming to reach deep into her bones. She didn't have all the answers either, but maybe that was okay. "Maybe forgiveness is something we give ourselves when we're ready," she said, her voice barely above a murmur. "Maybe it's not something we can force." Wyatt didn't respond right away, but after a moment he gave a slow nod. "Maybe you're right." There was a quiet understanding between them now, an unspoken bond forged in the shared space of their silence. They weren't healed, far from it, but maybe, just maybe, they were both taking the first steps toward it. The fire began to dwindle, the flames casting long shadows across the ground. Isabella wrapped her blanket tighter around her shoulders, the chill of the night creeping in, but for the first time in a long while, she didn't feel quite so alone. They sat in silence for a while, neither of them needing to fill the space with words. The world outside was vast, untamed, but here, in this moment, they had each other's company, shared burdens, shared silence. As the fire finally died down to glowing embers, Wyatt stood, stretching his legs. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice returning to its usual gruffness. "Tomorrow's another long ride." Isabella nodded, standing as well, her body aching from the day's ride. She tied her mare to a nearby tree, the familiar motion soothing in its repetition. "Yeah," she said, glancing at him. "Another long ride." The air was crisp, and as she settled into her bedroll, she couldn't shake the feeling that the path ahead was full of more than just the wilderness. There were questions still lingering, and answers that weren't easy to come by, but for the first time in a long while, she felt the possibility of something better on the horizon, something that didn't involve running. As the camp settled into silence, both of them still awake in their own thoughts, Isabella realized that their journey had just begun. And in a way, they were both learning what it meant to forgive not just each other, but themselves. The night pressed on, the darkness wrapping around them like a blanket, and as sleep finally claimed her, Isabella let herself believe that maybe, just maybe, she was on the right path. The sound of hooves on the dry, cracked earth echoed between the abandoned buildings as Isabella and Wyatt rode into the ghost town. The once thriving mining settlement was now little more than a collection of crumbling facades and rusted remnants of a bygone era. The streets were lined with dilapidated saloons, their windows broken, and signs hanging limply on their last hinges. Faded posters fluttered in the wind, their colorful promises of wealth long turned to dust. Isabella couldn't help but feel the weight of the town's history press against her as she scanned the silent streets. It was the kind of place that had once been full of life, full of hope, and now it stood as a skeleton of what it had been. She felt like an intruder, a ghost wandering through a place that had been forgotten by time. Wyatt pulled his horse to a stop beside her, his eyes scanning the street with a practiced wariness. "This place looks like it's been dead for a long time," he muttered, his voice low. "Not much life left here." Isabella's gaze lingered on a tattered sign hanging above what had once been a bustling saloon. It now swayed in the breeze like a broken promise. "I don't know," she said, her tone thoughtful. "There's something about it, like it's waiting for something." "Could be," Wyatt said, his eyes narrowing as he scanned the area. "Could also be it's just waiting for the next fool to wander in." With that, he nudged his horse forward, leading the way down the street. Isabella followed, feeling the unsettling emptiness of the place seep into her bones. As they rode deeper into the ghost town, the remnants of its past began to unfold. Broken wooden planks and discarded crates lined the streets, evidence of a hasty departure or a slow decay. The air was thick with dust, and the only sound besides their horses' hooves was the occasional rustle of a distant wind sweeping through the broken windows of the buildings. Wyatt led them toward the saloon, its faded red paint barely visible under the layers of dust. The doors creaked as they pushed them open, and the smell of stale liquor and mildew filled the air. The inside was just as abandoned as the outside. The once polished bar now lay covered in dust, bottles long emptied and chairs overturned, as though they had been abandoned mid-brawl. The dim light filtering through the broken windows created a ghostly glow, casting long shadows across the room. "Well, this is charming," Isabella said dryly, looking around. "What exactly are we looking for here?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. Instead, he stepped up to the bar, his hand resting on the weathered wood. "We're looking for answers. And sometimes, the answers show up where you least expect them." Isabella watched him, feeling the weight of his words. She didn't know what they were hoping to find in a place like this, but it was clear that Wyatt had a reason for stopping here. She followed him as he made his way toward the back of the saloon, where a small doorway led to what was once a storeroom. As they entered the dimly lit room, Wyatt's eyes immediately locked onto a small table in the corner, covered in old, dust-covered papers and odds and ends. He walked over to it, carefully pushing aside a stack of old maps and discarded newspapers. "There's something here," he muttered under his breath. Isabella moved closer, her curiosity piqued. "What is it?" Wyatt held up a small, crumpled piece of paper, its edges torn and frayed. The ink was faint, but the letters were still legible. "It's a note," he said, scanning it quickly. "Something about an outlaw named Roland Vasseur." Isabella's heart skipped a beat at the mention of the name. Roland Vasseur was no stranger to her. He was a notorious criminal in these parts. A man whose name had been whispered in fear for years. But how did his name end up on a piece of paper in an abandoned saloon? Wyatt didn't seem to notice her sudden change in expression. He continued reading, his brow furrowing as he scanned the words. "This is interesting," he muttered. "It talks about Vasseur meeting someone in the back of this town, something about a shipment of stolen goods, and..." He trailed off, his eyes narrowing. "And a locket. A locket like the one you're wearing?" Isabella's breath caught in her throat. She'd been carrying the locket for weeks, its weight a constant reminder of her past. But now, as Wyatt's words sank in, she realized that her journey wasn't just about running away from her past, it was about uncovering a web of secrets that tied her to it. "Is it possible?" she asked quietly, almost to herself. Wyatt met her gaze, his face serious. "Possible? I reckon it's more than just possible. It looks like your past is catching up with you, whether you're ready for it or not." The silence that followed was thick with tension. Isabella's mind was spinning. She had known, deep down, that the locket held more than sentimental value, but to think that it might be connected to a criminal like Roland Vasseur, the thought made her stomach turn. Wyatt's voice broke through her thoughts. "You ready to talk about it?" She shook her head, her eyes flickering to the paper in his hand. "I don't know what there is to talk about. It's just a family heirloom, something my father gave me before I left." Wyatt's lips quirked into a half smile. "And you think that's all it is?" Isabella glanced at him, her heart pounding. What else could it be? Wyatt let out a breath, his eyes scanning the room again. "I'm not sure yet, but whatever it is, I'm guessing it's connected to more than just your father." Isabella's chest tightened. She didn't know how much she could handle, how many more secrets from her past she could unearth, but it seemed like every step she took in this wilderness only led her deeper into the mystery surrounding the locket and into her own tangled past. Wyatt looked at her again, his gaze softening. "We'll figure this out," he said quietly. "Together." Isabella met his gaze, the weight of his words sinking in. She didn't know if she was ready to face the truth, but there was something in his eyes, something that made her believe that maybe, just maybe, she didn't have to face it alone. A sudden noise from the front of the saloon interrupted their conversation, followed by the sound of footsteps on the wooden porch. Wyatt's hand went to the rifle slung across his back, his body tense and alert. "Looks like we're not alone anymore," he muttered. Isabella's heart skipped a beat. The sound of footsteps grew louder, closer now. Whoever it was, they weren't here for friendly conversation. Wyatt gestured to her silently, his expression hardening. "Stay close," he whispered, "and don't make a sound." Isabella's hand instinctively went to her knife, her body poised for whatever might come next. She didn't know what was waiting for them outside, but one thing was certain. The answers to her past were about to be uncovered, whether she was ready for them or not. Chapter 5. A Minor Chase. Isabella and Wyatt had barely crossed the threshold of the saloon when a chill ran down her spine. She couldn't explain it. Maybe it was the way the air seemed to still around them, or how the few remaining patrons in the room quickly fell silent, their eyes darting toward the door, then back to their drinks. Whatever it was, it made her feel like an outsider in a place where strangers weren't welcomed. Wyatt scanned the room, his hand hovering near the holster of his gun. He didn't like the way the place felt either. They'd come here looking for answers, and already the town was giving off an unsettling vibe. "Something's not right," Wyatt muttered, eyes narrowing at the cluster of locals huddled around the bar. "Stay close." Isabella followed his lead, trying to ignore the prickle of tension creeping up her neck. As they made their way toward a corner table, a voice rang out from the back of the room. "Looks like we've got some new company." The man's voice was smooth, almost too smooth. He had that calm authority of someone used to being in control. Isabella froze, and Wyatt's posture stiffened beside her. "Never seen you around before," the man continued, stepping out from the shadows near the back door. He was tall, his broad shoulders encased in a dusty coat, his face half hidden under the brim of a wide hat. He was flanked by two others, who looked like they'd spent the last few years getting rougher with each passing day. "Well, now you've seen us," Wyatt said, his voice easy but his hand moving ever so slightly closer to his gun. "We're just passing through." The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Passing through, huh? Well, I reckon the town's been plenty quiet for too long. Not too many folks passing through these parts." Isabella could feel the tension in the air thickening. They were too close to something. She just wasn't sure what yet. "You know," she said, trying to sound casual, "it's funny you should mention that. We're looking for someone, actually. Maybe you've heard of him. Roland Vasseur?" The man's eyes flicked to the two men beside him, a silent exchange happening between them before he looked back at Isabella, his smile fading into something more dangerous. "You don't belong here," he said flatly, "and neither does that name. Maybe you ought to take your business somewhere else before things get difficult." Isabella stepped forward, her own eyes narrowing. "I don't think you understand. I'm not here to make trouble. I just need some answers. We just need some answers." The silence in the room grew thick. Lyon took a step back, his gaze flicking around the room to the exits. "I think it's time we leave," Wyatt said, his voice low, "before this gets ugly." As if on cue, the man's smile returned, but this time it was cold, and his two companions suddenly moved with swift precision, blocking their way to the door. "Not so fast," the man drawled. "You should have minded your own business, friend. Now I reckon you've got another problem." Before Wyatt could react, one of the men lunged forward, grabbing Isabella by the arm. She reacted instinctively, twisting in his grip and driving her elbow into his stomach. He staggered back, cursing just as Wyatt drew his gun, the sharp crack of the shot ringing out like a warning. "Get off her!" Wyatt roared. A chaotic blur of motion erupted around them. The man who had grabbed Isabella lunged again, but Wyatt was faster this time, his precise shot knocking the gun from the attacker's hand. The other man drew a knife, his eyes wild as he slashed through the air, but Isabella ducked, her heart racing. "Wyatt," she shouted, dodging another slash. "I need something to block him!" Without missing a beat, Wyatt threw a chair toward her. She grabbed it, using it to parry the knife's blade just in time. The impact was enough to knock the knife wielder off balance, giving her the moment she needed to bring her heel down on his foot, forcing him to stumble back. Wyatt was already moving, his gun trained on the other man as he backed up toward the door. His hand steady, his aim true. "Don't make me use this again," he growled, his voice cool but dangerous. The man hesitated for only a moment before retreating, his hands raised in mock surrender. "Guess we'll let you go this time," he muttered before turning toward the door. "But don't come back." Isabella kept the chair raised, still catching her breath, watching as the men filed out, disappearing into the dust and the shadows. She stood there, a little shaken, but mostly relieved. "Did you have to shoot?" she asked, her voice a little breathless, but her tone sharp. Wyatt holstered his gun, a grin tugging at his lips. "You didn't seem like you were doing a very good job of getting rid of him, so I helped out." She rolled her eyes, setting the chair down with a thud. "Well, thanks for the help. That was..." She paused, her lips twitching in spite of herself. "Entertaining." Wyatt gave her a look, the corners of his mouth turning up. "I wouldn't call it entertaining, but it sure was a damn sight better than what would have happened if I hadn't stepped in." Isabella shrugged, her heart still racing. "Guess I can take care of myself, but I'll let you have this one." She tilted her head toward the now empty room, where the tension had already begun to dissipate. "So what do you think about these guys? They clearly didn't like us asking about Vasseur." Wyatt rubbed the back of his neck, clearly thinking it over. "Seems like they're trying to keep something buried here. Vasseur, the locket. Maybe it all ties together. We just need to dig a little deeper." Isabella frowned. "I've been digging long enough, but it feels like I'm chasing a ghost. How many more dead ends are we going to run into?" Wyatt shot her a look, the smile gone now, replaced by a quiet determination. "As many as it takes," he said simply. "We're not done yet, not by a long shot." The two of them walked out of the saloon, leaving the empty town behind. The heat of the day was already beginning to creep in, but the air was still thick with the dust of the confrontation. As they mounted their horses, the mystery of the locket and its connection to the outlaw Vasseur hung over them, unresolved. But for the first time in a while, Isabella felt like they were on the right path. The chase, though brief, had proven that they were digging in the right place. Wyatt's steady presence beside her gave her a sense of purpose, something she hadn't realized she needed. "Let's see where this trail leads us next," she said, her voice determined. Wyatt nodded, guiding his horse into motion. "It's a long road ahead, but it'll be worth it." As they rode down the dusty trail, the clues from the ghost town slowly began to fit together in her mind, each new piece adding to the puzzle. But with each answer, a new question arose, one that promised to reveal a truth that would change everything. And she had a feeling that the answers they sought weren't just buried in the past, they were waiting for them in the future. Isabella stood at the edge of the glade, her boots sinking into the soft earth as she gazed out at the sprawling wilderness before her. The quiet of the place felt like a balm to her frayed nerves. Here, deep in the heart of the wilderness, she could almost forget the weight of the world. The tall pines stood like silent sentinels around her, their needles whispering with the gentle wind, and the creek that ran nearby offered the soft murmur of rushing water. She wasn't sure why she'd walked so far away from camp, but something had urged her to step into the solitude. The fire had been warm and the food had been good, but there was something she couldn't shake. The locket, that damn locket. Taking a deep breath, Isabella pulled it from the folds of her coat, the cool metal cold against her skin. She hadn't examined it closely in days, the weight of it always lingering as a reminder of everything she'd left behind. But today felt different. There was something about the light here, something that made her want to see it, really see it, for the first time. She sat down on a large rock, the locket nestled in her palm, her fingers tracing the ornate filigree. The details were more intricate than she'd remembered. each swirl and curve etched into the metal with a skill that spoke of a time long gone. Her eyes narrowed as she inspected it more closely, the design familiar yet foreign, stirring something deep inside of her. For the first time, she noticed a faint line running along the inside of the locket. She hadn't been able to make it out before, but now, with the sunlight filtering through the trees, the engraving seemed to shimmer with new light. She swallowed hard, her pulse quickening as she ran her fingers along the inscription. There, hidden in the pattern, was a name she'd never expected to see, Roland Vasseur. Her breath caught in her throat. Her mind spun as she recalled the conversations, the murmurs of outlaws and betrayal, the whispers of her father's downfall. Roland Vasseur, the same name that had been linked to the darkest parts of her family's past. But it wasn't just the name, it was the symbol beneath it, an emblem she had seen before. It was unmistakable, unmistakably tied to her father's legacy. Isabella's hand trembled as she held the locket up to the light, the faded letters and the symbol searing into her mind. This locket was no mere family heirloom. It was a key to the dark history she had tried so hard to escape. Suddenly, a rustling in the brush behind her made her stiffen. She turned, quickly slipping the locket back into her coat pocket, her heart racing. Wyatt stepped into the clearing, his expression unreadable, his eyes scanning the space around them before landing on her. "You've got that look again," he said quietly, his voice gruff. "Like you've just discovered something that's going to make things worse." Isabella stood up, brushing the dirt from her skirt. "I think I've just discovered something that changes everything." Wyatt's brow furrowed, his eyes sharp. "What do you mean?" She didn't respond right away, her mind racing with the implications of her discovery. This wasn't just about a locket anymore. It was about a legacy. Her family's legacy, and the dark undercurrents that had been dragging her family under for years. But she wasn't ready to reveal it, not yet. Wyatt stepped closer, his gaze never leaving hers. "You're still hiding something. Whatever you found out there, I can see it in your eyes." Isabella hesitated for a moment longer, then took a deep breath. "I don't know how to tell you this, Wyatt," she said, her voice tight. "But your father, Roland Vasseur, his name is on that locket." Wyatt's expression didn't change immediately. He stood there, motionless, as though the words had struck him harder than he had expected. The seconds stretched into an eternity, the air around them thick with the weight of what she'd just said. "What?" Wyatt finally managed, his voice a whisper. "I didn't want to believe it," Isabella continued, her voice quiet but resolute. "But it's true. The locket? It's tied to my family's history. And now I know that Roland Vasseur, the outlaw you've been hunting, is somehow connected to everything I've been running from." Wyatt stood still, his face betraying nothing, but Isabella could see the subtle shift in his eyes. A flicker of recognition that quickly turned into something colder. He took a slow step back, his hands resting at his sides. "So, you think your family's been tied to my father all along?" Wyatt's voice was low, his tone steady but filled with a quiet rage that simmered beneath the surface. "And now you're telling me that the locket is the link?" Isabella nodded, her throat tight. "Yes. I think everything I've been running from is connected to him. And to you." Wyatt's face twisted slightly, his expression hardening. "Don't start blaming me for what my father did, Isabella," he said sharply, his voice edged with something raw. "I wasn't the one who caused this mess. I'm just trying to clean it up." The tension between them thickened, the weight of the truth settling in the space between them. The air felt heavy, as if everything they'd built up to this point was teetering on the edge of something that could shatter their fragile alliance. Isabella opened her mouth to respond, but before she could, Wyatt spoke again, his voice colder now. "Don't think this changes anything," he said, his gaze hard and distant. "You think you can throw that in my face and expect it to fix what's broken? We both got our demons, Isabella, you and me both, but you better believe that I won't let you use my father's name to drag me down." She swallowed, the bitterness of his words cutting through her. "I'm not blaming you. I never did. I don't know what any of this means yet, but I can't ignore it anymore. Wyatt turned, his back to her, his posture rigid as he walked toward the horses. He didn't say anything more, but Isabella knew that the moment had passed. They couldn't unhear the truth now. They couldn't erase what had been revealed. As she followed him toward the horses, she realized something in that moment. No matter what happened next, their paths were now irrevocably intertwined. The past had a way of catching up with you, and now the locket had become the thread that tied them together in ways neither of them had anticipated. They didn't speak again as they saddled their horses. The sound of the leather creaking, the horses' soft snorts, and the distant rustling of leaves were the only sounds in the otherwise still air. The truth had been revealed, and now they had no choice but to ride forward. Together or apart. The morning light bled through the trees in pale bands, casting long shadows over the frostbitten ground. Isabella sat motionless on her horse, her eyes fixed on the ground in front of her, though she saw little. The crisp air bit at her skin, but she didn't feel the cold. The discovery of the locket's inscription was still fresh, its weight heavier than any winter chill. She stole a glance at Wyatt, riding silently beside her. His face was unreadable, a mask of quiet torment, but she could see the subtle tension in his shoulders, the rigid way he sat in the saddle. He had been the one to break the silence first, but now neither of them spoke. There was nothing left to say, not after the truth had been laid bare between them. Her fingers gripped the reins tighter, her knuckles white. She had asked for the truth, and she had gotten it, but it felt like a betrayal, not just of her family, but of the fragile trust she had been building with Wyatt. He had known. He had known more than he had let on, and now she couldn't shake the image of him standing there in the saloon, his eyes filled with something she couldn't quite decipher, something that said he knew. Her voice broke the silence, sharp and strained. "You knew, didn't you, all this time? About Vasseur, about the locket, about everything?" Wyatt's jaw tightened, but he didn't respond immediately. His eyes were focused ahead, but she could feel him withdrawing as though retreating from her words. It angered her, the way he had kept the truth from her, the way he had kept his secrets locked behind a facade of quiet distance. "Answer me," she pressed, her voice rising despite herself. "You've been hiding it, haven't you?" He sighed, a long, tired exhale, and finally his eyes flicked toward her. "I didn't think you were ready for that kind of truth, Isabella." She gave a bitter laugh. "And you thought I'd just ride along like a fool, trusting you, trusting the locket without ever knowing the truth." "I didn't want to hurt you," Wyatt said, his voice low but edged with frustration. "It wasn't my place to drag you into this mess, to make you carry my father's sins along with your own." She met his gaze, her chest tightening. "And I suppose I should just forget that you're the son of the very man I've been running from, that your family is tied to mine in ways I never could have imagined?" Wyatt's expression hardened. "What do you want me to say? That I knew everything from the start? That I knew the locket would bring everything crashing down?" His voice cracked slightly as he spoke, a tremor that betrayed the strength of his resolve. "I've been trying to outrun him, trying to make my own way. But you're right. There's no running from the past. It finds you no matter how far you go." Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat. She had always known there were pieces of Wyatt's past he hadn't shared, but hearing the confession now, the rawness in his voice, it felt like a betrayal of its own. She hadn't asked for this connection, hadn't asked to be tied to the very man who had stolen everything from her family. "Why didn't you tell me?" she whispered, the words heavy with hurt. "Why keep me in the dark?" Wyatt didn't answer right away. His gaze dropped to the reins in his hands, his fingers twitching in a way that suggested he was lost in his thoughts. "I didn't think it mattered," he said, his voice quiet now, almost regretful. "I didn't think it would change anything, but now it changes everything." Isabella didn't know what to say. Her thoughts churned, spiraling into a vortex of confusion. The man who had been by her side for weeks, the man who had fought alongside her, was tied to the very darkness she had been trying to escape. How could she trust him now? How could she trust anyone when betrayal ran so deep? The silence between them deepened, heavier now. The only sounds were the clatter of their horses' hooves on the frost-covered ground and the occasional rustling of leaves in the wind. Eventually, they reached the ravine, a rocky gap in the earth that looked like a good place to make camp for the night. Wyatt led the way, guiding his horse to a small clearing where the trees provided some shelter. They dismounted, the familiar routine of setting up camp grounding them despite the storm of emotions between them. Isabella moved slowly, her hands trembling as she unpacked her supplies. She wasn't sure how to navigate this new tension between them, how to pretend everything was fine when it wasn't. The locket in her pocket felt like an anchor, dragging her down with its heavy truth. She sat down on a flat rock near the edge of the ravine, the fire flickering between them. Wyatt had already begun working on setting up a fire, his movements mechanical, as though the act of building something tangible could somehow stave off the intangible wreckage in his heart. Isabella stared at the fire, lost in her thoughts. She could feel his presence, the weight of his gaze as he worked, but neither of them spoke. "Are you going to tell me everything now?" she asked, the words slipping out before she could stop them. Her voice sounded raw, fragile even to her own ears. Wyatt paused in his work, glancing over at her. "What do you want to know?" Isabella's voice trembled, but she didn't look at him. "Everything. I want to know everything, Wyatt. The truth, all of it." He didn't answer right away. Instead, he slowly sat down beside her, his eyes distant as he looked out over the ravine. "You already know more than you should," he said softly. "But I'll tell you this. My father wasn't always a monster. He had his reasons, but he made choices, terrible choices, and now I'm the one left to deal with the mess he left behind." Isabella turned to face him, her brow furrowed. "And you think I'm supposed to forgive you for that? For him? For everything?" Wyatt's eyes met hers, and in them she saw the flicker of something. Regret, sorrow, maybe even... "I'm not asking for your forgiveness, Isabella. I'm just telling you that I never wanted to drag you into this. But now, with the locket, with everything that's happening, I'm not sure we have a choice anymore." The fire crackled between them, the heat from the flames doing little to warm the cold distance between them. Isabella could feel her heart pounding in her chest, her breath coming in shallow bursts. This wasn't the reunion she had hoped for, this wasn't the closure she'd been seeking, but it was the truth, and now she had to decide what to do with it. Before she could speak, the sound of hooves interrupted their fragile moment. Wyatt's head snapped up, his eyes narrowing as he stood quickly, reaching for his rifle. "Stay here," he ordered, his voice sharp with authority. "I'll check it out." Isabella nodded, her heart pounding. She could feel the weight of their conversation still hanging in the air, but now something more immediate was threatening to break the fragile silence. A figure on horseback appeared through the trees, the rider moving with a sense of urgency. Wyatt stepped forward, his rifle held steady, as the rider came closer. "Wyatt!" the rider shouted, his voice tight with urgency. "The land baron's mobilizing his men. They're coming for you. They know you've been asking questions about Vassor." The world seemed to pause, the revelations sinking in. Wyatt's eyes flashed with a mixture of anger and determination. Isabella felt the weight of it too. They had no time to deal with their fractured trust. The land baron's men were coming, and whatever lay ahead, they would have to face it together. Wyatt's gaze flicked to Isabella, his voice low but urgent. "Pack up. We leave now. There's no time to waste." As Isabella gathered her things, her thoughts racing, she couldn't help but wonder if their fractured alliance would survive the coming storm, or if the truth of the locket would tear them apart for good. Chapter 6. The Noose Tightens. The dusty streets of the frontier town stretched out before them like a dry, cracked riverbed, with nothing but the sun overhead and the ever-present wind kicking up dust into the air. As Isabella and Wyatt rode in, they were immediately struck by the oppressive silence that hung over the place. The dilapidated storefronts stood like broken teeth in a mouth, their paint peeling, their windows either boarded up or shrouded with grimy curtains. The town seemed to hold its breath. There were no bustling sounds of everyday life, no children's laughter or the clink of metal on metal. Instead, the few souls who dared to venture outside kept their heads down, eyes shifting nervously as the strangers passed by. "Feels like we've ridden into the lion's den," Isabella murmured, her voice barely above a whisper. Wyatt glanced around, his posture rigid as he scanned the town with the sharp focus of a man who had spent too much of his life looking over his shoulder. "I don't like it," he said simply. "They know we're here." Isabella swallowed, her stomach a tight knot. She hadn't expected a warm welcome, but this kind of cold reception was something else entirely. She could feel the weight of every suspicious stare and every hushed whisper that followed them as they made their way to the saloon. The sign above the door creaked in the wind, the letters half erased, but the dim light spilling through the crack in the door offered a glimmer of hope. They needed answers, and the saloon, old as it was the only place where someone might be willing to talk. Wyatt dismounted with a practiced ease, his boots landing softly on the dirt. He gave Isabella a nod, his face grim. "Stay close. Don't trust anyone in here." "I've learned that lesson already," Isabella muttered, following him into the saloon. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale whiskey and tobacco smoke. The low murmur of conversation fell silent as they entered. A couple of heads turned, their gazes fleeting before quickly looking away. But the tension in the room was palpable. Isabella and Wyatt made their way to the bar, where the bartender, a man with a weathered face and a perpetual scowl, glanced at them briefly before turning his attention back to cleaning a glass. "We're looking for information," Wyatt said in a low, no-nonsense voice, leaning in just enough to be heard. "About the land baron, about the marshal." The bartender paused, his rag still in his hand, his eyes flicking nervously to the back of the room. "I don't know what you're talking about," he said, his tone flat, but his eyes betrayed him, darting to the far corner of the saloon. Isabella followed his gaze, her eyes narrowing as she saw a man sitting in the shadows, watching them intently. Wyatt was already moving before the bartender could speak again, his hand resting casually on the gun at his hip. "We're not here to cause trouble," he said, his voice steady but firm. "But we're not leaving until we get answers." The bartender swallowed, his hand shaking ever so slightly as he set the glass down. "You're looking for trouble, then. The marshal ain't the same man he used to be, and the land baron's got his fingers in too many pies around here. You'd be better off turning around while you still can." Isabella took a deep breath, her fingers curling around the edge of the counter. "The marshal's been involved with my family," she said quietly, "and I need to know what happened, what he's hiding." The bartender shifted uncomfortably, his gaze darting to the back of the room once more. "You don't want to go stirring up things with the marshal, miss. He used to be a friend to your father, sure, but the man we're dealing with now, he's not the same." Before either of them could press further, the door to the saloon burst open with a loud bang, and a group of men entered. Their eyes were cold, their hands resting casually on their holsters. They didn't say a word, but their presence spoke volumes. The tension in the room thickened, and Isabella felt a chill run down her spine. Wyatt didn't flinch, but she could see the shift in his posture as he subtly moved closer to her, his hand going to his gun with the ease of someone who had spent years in hostile situations. The leader of the group, a tall man with a scar running down his cheek, glanced toward Wyatt and Isabella before nodding to one of his men. "You two are asking too many questions," he said in a gravelly voice, his eyes hard. "You're gonna have to leave, now." Isabella's heart pounded, but she forced herself to stay calm. Wyatt's hand twitched at his side, and she could tell he was weighing his options. "Not until we're done," Wyatt said evenly, his gaze never leaving the leader's face. The man's lips curled into a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "You're asking for trouble," he said, his voice low, a threat lacing every word. "And trouble's what you'll get." Without warning, the leader lunged toward Wyatt, and the saloon erupted into chaos. Chairs scraped back, voices shouted, and the crack of gunfire split the air as Wyatt drew his gun with lightning speed. The first man went down with a grunt, and the rest of the gang lunged forward, knives drawn, pistols raised. "Move," Wyatt shouted, grabbing Isabella's arm and pulling her toward the back door. They bolted into the narrow alley behind the saloon, the sounds of their pursuers echoing in their wake. Horses were tethered nearby, and Wyatt pushed her toward one of them. "Get on," he snapped, his voice tense with urgency. Isabella's breath caught in her throat as she scrambled onto the horse, her fingers shaking as she gripped the reins. Wyatt was already on his horse, spurring it forward. "Hold on," he shouted as they tore through the alleyway and onto the main street. The horse's hooves pounded against the uneven cobblestones, the sound of gunfire still ringing in the distance. The gang was hot on their trail. Wyatt's rifle cracked twice, and 2 of the men fell back, but there were more ahead waiting in the streets. Isabella's heart was in her throat as she leaned forward, urging the horse faster. The wind whipped past her, the town's buildings blurring in the background as they galloped through the narrow streets. "Up ahead!" Wyatt shouted, pointing toward an open gap between the buildings. "Go left!" They veered sharply, dodging the obstacles in their path, but the gang was relentless. Gunfire echoed again, and Wyatt's horse stumbled, nearly throwing him off balance. But he recovered quickly, his eyes scanning the street ahead. "We've got to lose them," he barked, as they cut through another alley. Isabella's mind raced, her heart still thundering in her chest. They couldn't keep running forever. But they didn't have time to think about strategy, only survival. Finally, after what felt like hours, they burst out onto an open road. The gang had fallen behind, the sound of their pursuit fading into the distance. Wyatt slowed his horse, his breathing heavy, and Isabella followed suit, her hands shaking as she reined in the horse. "We're clear," Wyatt muttered, his eyes scanning the road behind them. "For now." Isabella exhaled sharply, her body still trembling with adrenaline. What the hell just happened back there? Wyatt looked at her, his face grim. "We've stirred up something much bigger than we thought. They're not just after us. They're after anyone who gets too close to the truth." Isabella swallowed, her mind reeling. The chase, the gunfire, the anger in the men's eyes, it was clear now. They were no longer just pawns in someone else's game. They were playing for keeps, and the stakes were higher than she ever could have imagined. As they rode in silence, the weight of what lay ahead hung over them. But there was no turning back now. They had come too far, and whatever the cost, they would have to face the truth together. Isabella sat against the rough, splintered wood of the barn's wall, her knees pulled up to her chest. The shadows around her felt like they were closing in, the barn's old beams groaning in protest as the wind outside picked up. Dust swirled in the dim light that filtered through the cracks in the wood, and her thoughts, darker than the shadows that danced on the walls, seemed to swirl just as violently. The sting of betrayal had settled in her chest, a weight that pressed down on her lungs. She couldn't shake the image of Wyatt standing there, his hand so steady on the rifle as he'd taken down the men who'd been after them. But it wasn't the gunfire that haunted her. It was the look in his eyes after, the one that had told her that everything had changed between them. Her fingers traced the locket once again, the cold metal a familiar comfort against her fingertips. She couldn't escape its significance, its connection to her family's downfall. The symbol, the inscription, the dark ties that bound her to this place, to this fight. A memory flashed unbidden, her father's strong, weathered hands passing the locket to her. A smile that had once been warm, full of hope. "This is a reminder of where you come from, Isabella. Never forget who you are." She'd carried it ever since, with pride, but now it felt like a chain around her neck, weighing her down with every breath. She let out a shaky breath and clenched her hands around the locket. Who was she now? The quiet creak of the barn door pulled her from her thoughts, but it wasn't Wyatt. He'd gone off hours ago, leaving her in this empty place. The silence of the barn seemed to echo his absence. She closed her eyes, wishing the world would stop for just a moment. But there was no stopping it. Not now, not ever. Miles away, deep within the cavernous darkness of the cave, Wyatt sat on a cold, jagged rock, his back to the wall. His eyes were closed, his breath steady, but his mind raced, a storm of remorse and anger waging war inside him. He hated his father. God, how he hated him. Roland Vasseur. A name that had haunted his childhood, a name that had filled his mother's eyes with dread and his father's presence with cold indifference, a name that had driven Wyatt to leave home at 16, desperate to escape the weight of a legacy he never chose. But now that same legacy had dragged him back, tied him to the very thing he had been trying to outrun for years. And Isabella, her family, her past, had drawn him deeper into it than he could have ever imagined. His fingers clenched into fists at his sides. He wasn't a good man. He never had been. But he had tried to build a life that didn't carry the stain of his father's sins. And now it felt like all of it was falling apart, like he was powerless to stop it. He'd fought beside Isabella. He'd trusted her. And now he wasn't sure if that trust was enough to hold them together or if they'd fall apart with every passing moment. "What the hell am I doing?" he muttered to the cold, empty air, his voice breaking as the cavern seemed to swallow the sound. The echoes of his words bounced off the cave walls, mocking him. He rubbed his eyes, trying to push away the exhaustion that had settled into his bones. He could still hear her voice, her words, the hurt in them. The way she'd looked at him when she realized the truth about the locket. And the worst part? He knew she was right to be angry. He'd lied to her. Not just by omission, but by letting her believe in something that wasn't true. He had no excuse. He never had. "I'm just as damned as he was," he whispered to the dark. There was no escaping the blood that ran through his veins, no outrunning the truth. His father's sins were his sins now. His mistakes were his to bear. He stood abruptly, his fists clenched by his sides. "Hell with it," he muttered. "Hell with all of it." But deep down, he knew he couldn't walk away from it. From her. From the mess they'd found themselves in. No matter how much he wanted to. No matter how much he hated himself for it. Isabella's heart beat in her throat as she clutched the locket tighter, the metal digging into her palm. She didn't know how much longer she could keep running from the truth. Her father's name had been tied to it. Wyatt's father had been a part of the reason her family had fallen. And no matter how much she tried to deny it, no matter how hard she tried to hold on to what she thought she knew, everything was crumbling beneath her. A tear slipped down her cheek and she wiped it away quickly, her anger mixing with her grief. She didn't want to feel this. She didn't want to feel the ache of betrayal, the sharpness of loss, of the truth she had never asked for but had been thrust upon her. And Wyatt, the man she had trusted, he wasn't the hero she'd wanted him to be. He was as tangled in this mess as she was. She stood abruptly, her hands shaking as she pulled the saddlebag from the corner of the barn and began packing it with supplies. She didn't know where she was going. Hell, she didn't even know if she could trust herself anymore. But she had to keep moving. She couldn't stay here, stuck in this web of lies and regrets. A distant sound reached her ears and she froze. The soft clip-clop of hooves, slow but deliberate, reached her through the barn's thin walls. She'd heard the sound enough times to recognize Wyatt's horse. Her heart twisted painfully. She didn't want to face him. Not yet. Not after everything that had been laid bare between them. But before she could decide what to do, the door to the barn creaked open. Wyatt stood there, framed in the doorway, his expression unreadable. Neither of them spoke. The silence between them was thick, suffocating. He took a hesitant step forward, his boots scraping against the wooden floor. "I was going to leave," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "But I can't. I don't even know where I'd go." Wyatt's gaze softened for a fleeting moment, but then the wall went back up. "You can't outrun this," he said, his voice quiet. "You can't outrun me. Or the truth, no matter how much you want to." She turned away, her fingers tightening around the saddlebag. "I never asked for any of this. I didn't ask to be tied to your past, to your family, to your father." His voice softened, but it was still heavy with the weight of his own shame. "I didn't ask for it either, Isabella. But it's ours now, whether we like it or not." Isabella swallowed the lump in her throat, her eyes burning as the tears threatened to spill once more. But she wouldn't let them fall. Not yet. Not in front of him. "Then what now?" she asked, her voice breaking. "What happens now, Wyatt?" He stepped closer, his boots scraping softly on the barn floor as he reached out, his hand hovering just short of touching her. "We keep moving," he said, his voice low, full of regret. "Together, whether we like it or not." The sound of his voice, of his words, hung in the air between them, fragile and tentative. Neither of them moved. Neither of them knew where to go from here, but as the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, the world seemed to hold its breath. Both of them stood on the edge of something, and whether it was a chasm or a bridge, neither of them knew. But they had to cross it. Together. Chapter 7. Forging Redemption. The storm came out of nowhere. One moment, the day had been relatively clear, the sun warm on their backs as they continued their journey through the jagged mountain pass. But as soon as the first distant crack of thunder split the sky, the weather turned violent, the wind howling like a beast set loose from its cage. Within moments, the sky had darkened, and sheets of rain began to pour down in torrents, cold and unforgiving. Isabella's horse skittered, nearly losing its footing on the slick ground as the rain lashed at her face. Her clothes were soon drenched, clinging to her skin, the cold sinking into her bones. She could barely hear anything over the roar of the storm, but she knew they needed to find shelter, fast. She glanced over at Wyatt, who was struggling to control his own horse, his jaw set in grim determination. Without a word, he veered his mount toward a craggy outcrop on the mountainside, a narrow crevice in the rock that seemed to promise some shelter from the raging storm. "Over here!" Wyatt shouted above the wind, his voice barely audible. Isabella nodded, urging her horse forward. She didn't care about anything else but getting out of the storm's fury. The shelter was small, but just big enough for both of them and their horses. They dismounted quickly, seeking refuge in the cave-like overhang as the storm raged outside. The rain came down in sheets, slamming into the rocks, the wind howling like a living thing, shaking the walls of the crag. The air inside the outcrop was thick with dampness, the smell of wet earth and stone filling their lungs. Isabella wiped the rain from her face, shivering as she moved toward the back of the shelter, trying to get as far from the storm as possible. Her clothes clung to her, and her hair was a sodden mess, hanging in damp tendrils around her face. She glanced over at Wyatt, who was doing the same, his eyes dark with exhaustion and frustration. "Well, this is just perfect," Isabella muttered, her voice tight with frustration. She threw her wet coat aside, the damp fabric making a heavy sound as it hit the ground. "Stuck in the middle of nowhere with you, during a storm, with no fire and no way out." Wyatt gave her a look, his expression unreadable, but his voice was sharp. "You think I'm happy about this? I didn't exactly plan to be stuck with you either." Isabella clenched her jaw, feeling the heat of her anger rise again. "Right. Because you've got such a good track record with this stuck with people business. How many times do I have to remind you that I'm not the one who kept secrets?" Wyatt stepped forward, his boots scraping against the ground as he closed the space between them. "We're not going to do this now," he said, his voice low but firm. "We've got bigger problems than our own damn baggage." "Oh, don't pretend like you're some sort of saint now," she shot back, her hands on her hips as she glared at him. "You've been keeping the truth from me, Wyatt, about your father, about everything. I trusted you, and you—" "I didn't ask for any of this," Wyatt interrupted, his voice rough. "I didn't ask for him to be my father, or for any of this mess to drag you into it. But don't you dare stand there and pretend like you've got a clean slate. You've got your own family skeletons rattling around just as much as I've got mine." Isabella flinched, her chest tightening. She knew he was right. She had always known her family's history wasn't something to be proud of, but somehow hearing him say it so bluntly made it worse. She had spent so long trying to bury her own past, trying to outrun it, and now here she was, trapped with a man whose own sins mirrored hers more than either of them wanted to admit. The silence between them stretched, thick and uncomfortable, the sound of the storm raging outside filling the space. Isabella felt the weight of her own breath, heavy and uneven, as she fought to keep her composure. Wyatt let out a long sigh, his shoulders slumping. "Look, I didn't mean it like that." He hesitated, his voice softer. "But damn it, Isabella, I didn't ask to be this man's son. I didn't ask to have his blood running through my veins." She turned away, her fingers trembling as she brushed her hair out of her face. "And what do you expect me to do with that? Forgive you because you didn't ask for it? You think just because you didn't ask for this life that I should just forget everything about what he did to my family?" Wyatt stepped closer, his voice almost a whisper now. "I don't expect forgiveness. Hell, I don't even know if I can forgive myself. But I know one thing. I didn't choose this." I didn't choose the man my father turned into. She felt her chest tighten, her throat thick with emotion as she turned to face him. His expression was raw now, his usual bravado stripped away. She could see the pain in his eyes, the weight of a lifetime spent fighting against something that wasn't his fault. I never wanted any of this, he said quietly. I never wanted to hurt you, Isabella, and I never wanted you to feel like you're tied to my past. A lump formed in her throat as she looked at him, the storm still raging outside, but the storm inside her seemed to settle, just a little. She didn't know if she could ever forgive him. Not yet, not now. But for the first time since this all started, she understood. None of us gets to choose our bloodlines, she whispered, her voice softer. But we get to choose what we do with it. We get to decide how we live even with the weight of it. The silence stretched again, but this time it wasn't suffocating. It was quiet, and in that quiet, Isabella felt something shift between them, something fragile but real. You're right, Wyatt said after a moment, his voice low. I'm not a saint, but I'm trying, and maybe that's all we can do. Isabella nodded slowly, the words he spoke settling in her heart. The storm outside continued to rage, but inside the shelter the air felt different, charged with something more than just the weight of their pasts. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. A flash of lightning split the sky, followed by the deafening crack of thunder. Wyatt glanced up, his eyes shifting toward the opening of the shelter. We'll be stuck here for a while, he said, his voice lighter now, a hint of humor creeping in. Might as well make the best of it. Isabella raised an eyebrow, a reluctant smile tugging at her lips. Oh, I'm sure you'll find some way to entertain me, Wyatt. After all, you're so good at keeping me on my toes. Wyatt gave a small chuckle, his shoulders relaxing for the first time in what felt like days. Well, if nothing else, I can keep you from freezing to death out there. Isabella rolled her eyes, but there was a softness to her gaze now, a tenderness she hadn't been willing to admit before. You're insufferable, you know that? Wyatt grinned, a genuine smile breaking through. I try. They both fell silent again, but the weight between them had shifted. It wasn't gone, not by a long shot, but it was different now. Maybe, just maybe, they could start to find their way through the storm. Together. As the night wore on and the storm continued to rage outside, they both sat in the quiet, the sound of the rain and wind filling the space around them. And though the world outside was still chaotic and uncertain, in that small, craggy shelter, they found a fragile kind of peace. It wasn't redemption, not yet, but it was the beginning of something that might one day lead them there, and for the first time in a long while, that was enough. The sun was beginning its slow descent behind the jagged mountains, painting the sky a fierce shade of blood orange. Isabella could feel the weight of the day's end pressing down on her, the cool evening air carrying with it a sense of finality. Her eyes narrowed as the fortified stronghold of the treacherous land baron loomed ahead. Rough-hewn planks and makeshift walls that seemed to defy the very winds of the mountain. The place felt more like a fortress than a home, a place where no one was meant to be welcome. Wyatt was riding beside her, his profile set in stone, his face as unreadable as the rock they were slowly approaching. His eyes never wavered from the fort in the distance. She could feel the tension radiating off him, the same tension she felt in the pit of her own stomach. Do you think we're ready for this? Isabella asked, her voice low, tinged with doubt. They'd been preparing for this moment for what felt like weeks, but the closer they got, the heavier the burden of their past seemed. Wyatt glanced at her, his lips pressed into a thin line. We don't have a choice. It's either now or never, Isabella. The sharp clang of hooves on the rocky ground was the only sound as they approached the gates of the stronghold. The light from the setting sun made the shadows of the makeshift fort stretch unnaturally long, as though the land itself was trying to swallow them whole. As they rode through the gates, the air felt thick with unspoken warnings. Enforcers watched from the shadows, their eyes narrowing as they recognized the pair. Two strangers walking straight into a den of thieves. The inside of the fort was far less grand than it had first seemed. It was a labyrinth of poorly constructed buildings, the smell of damp wood and sweat hanging heavy in the air. Isabella and Wyatt moved swiftly, their presence barely acknowledged as they made their way toward the center of the camp, where the Baron's men were gathered. Isabella's hand rested on the locket tucked safely beneath her jacket, the weight of it no longer a reminder of her family's past, but a weapon to ensure its future. She had spent hours, days even, piecing together the clues it had provided. The locket had led her here, to this moment, and she wasn't going to let it, or her family, be dismissed. At the center of the encampment, the land baron's men had gathered in a grim circle, speaking in hushed voices. Isabella could see the faces of men who had once believed in the promises of power and wealth, now worn down by the blood and sweat it took to hold onto it. Her heart thudded in her chest as she stepped forward, her voice clear and unwavering as she spoke, addressing the men in the circle. "I have something you all need to hear," Isabella declared, her voice cutting through the murmur of the crowd. The men turned to look at her, some with recognition, others with suspicion. She could feel their eyes on her, assessing her as if she were nothing more than a nuisance. Wyatt moved closer, but Isabella raised a hand to stop him. "This is my fight now," the land baron's lieutenant, a stocky man with a dirty, unshaven face, stepped forward. "And what makes you think you've got any say in this, lady?" he sneered. Isabella's chin lifted. "Because I know who you are. I know what you've done to my family, and I'm here to make sure you pay for it." From the back of the group, a familiar voice broke through the tension. "Isabella!" Her heart skipped a beat, and she turned to find the marshal standing in the doorway of a nearby shack. His face was drawn, older than she remembered, but it was him, the man who once swore to protect her family. "Marshal," she said, her voice barely a whisper. He looked haunted, his eyes dark with regret, but there was something else there too, something close to desperation. "I never meant for any of this to happen. I tried to stop him, but..." Isabella felt the ground beneath her shift. The marshal had once been a man of honor. At least, that's what her father had always said. But now, standing before her, she wasn't so sure. "I don't care about your excuses, Marshal," she snapped, her voice cold. "My family's blood is on your hands. You knew what he was doing, what the land baron was doing, and you chose to let it happen." The marshal flinched, guilt washing over his face like a wave. "I tried, Isabella. I really did, but he had the law on his side, and I was just one man. One man who..." He paused, his voice cracking. "A man who didn't do enough." The words hit her like a punch to the gut. This wasn't the marshal she had grown up with, the one who had promised to protect her father, the one who had sworn to always fight for what was right. This was a man broken by his own choices, a man who had failed her family. Wyatt stepped forward, his voice low but edged with anger. "It doesn't matter now. We've all been caught up in this mess. The question is, what are you going to do about it?" The marshal's shoulders slumped, and for the first time, Isabella saw the full weight of his regret. "I can't undo what I've done, but I can help you stop him before it's too late." Before Isabella could respond, the distant sound of boots stomping on dirt and the harsh clatter of weapons being drawn filled the air. The land baron's enforcers were closing in, their guns drawn, their eyes hard with malice. Wyatt's hand flew to his gun, his stance becoming more defensive. "Looks like this conversation's over," he muttered, his voice steady. Gunfire erupted in the air and chaos broke loose. Isabella ducked behind a nearby crate, her pulse racing as the men around her scrambled to take cover. Wyatt was already moving, his rifle in hand, as he picked off the first of the advancing enforcers. The noise of the fight blurred into the background, her focus narrowing to the task at hand. She couldn't afford to lose her nerve now, not with so much at stake. With one last glance at the marshal, she took a deep breath and sprinted forward, the locket heavy in her pocket as she aimed for the land baron's tent. Wyatt fought his way through the gunfire, his movements swift and calculated. Isabella could see the way he moved with purpose. His eyes locked on his target, his every motion a reflection of years spent in the heat of battle. As the last of the enforcers fell, silence descended on the battlefield, broken only by the sound of their breathing. Isabella and Wyatt stood amidst the wreckage of betrayal, their bodies bruised but their spirits resolute. The marshal stepped forward, his hands raised in surrender, his voice shaking with the weight of his confession. "It's over. I've done all I can." Isabella looked at him, her heart still heavy with the weight of his sins. But she knew that there was no room for anger now, not with the land baron defeated, not with her family's honor restored. "We'll have to live with what's been done," she said softly. "But we can choose to do better from here on out." Wyatt's voice was steady as he walked over, standing beside her. "Together," he said, his hand brushing against hers. As the sun dipped behind the mountains, casting the land in deep shadows, Isabella and Wyatt stood side by side, the chaos of the battle behind them. They had come through it, battered, bruised, but united. The storm had passed, and the path to redemption, though uncertain, had never seemed more possible. The morning light filtered gently through the cracked windows of the small homestead, casting soft beams of gold onto the worn wooden floor. The house, though weathered and battered by the elements, now seemed a refuge. Isabella sat on a faded quilt near the hearth, her fingers carefully pressing against a bandage wrapped around her side. The sting of the wound was nothing compared to the weight of everything that had happened, the fight, the revelations, and the choices they had made. Wyatt was nearby, kneeling over a small fire, the warmth from the embers barely cutting through the chill in the air. He had always been a man of few words, but today there was a stillness in him, a quiet kind of peace that made the whole world feel like it had paused for just a moment. "Could use a cup of coffee?" Wyatt muttered, his voice low and gruff, breaking the silence. "Couldn't make it for us, but I reckon that's your job." Isabella looked up from the bandage in her hands, the hint of a smile tugging at her lips. "You're lucky I even let you breathe after all the trouble you caused," she teased, but there was a softness to her voice that hadn't been there before. "Trouble?" Wyatt shot back, a grin tugging at the corner of his mouth. "I don't recall causing trouble. I'm just a man trying to keep us both alive." She snorted, her fingers brushing the edges of the bandage before she stood. "You have a funny way of keeping us alive, you know that? But I suppose I can forgive you, seeing as you were useful in the end." Wyatt chuckled low, his eyes crinkling at the edges. "I'm used to your forgiveness. It's become a habit." Isabella moved toward the stove, the familiar routine of making coffee somehow grounding. The world outside had quieted after the storm of the previous day. The land baron was gone, and with his fall, so too fell the grip of fear he had held over this part of the frontier. The townsfolk were starting to emerge, their cautious glances at the homestead revealing the hope they didn't yet know how to express. The sun had only just begun its climb when they heard the first knock on the door. Wyatt raised an eyebrow as Isabella opened it, revealing a young woman, one of the local settlers, standing on the threshold. Her eyes were wary, but there was a glimmer of hope beneath the surface. You two did it," the woman said hesitantly, glancing over her shoulder before stepping inside. "The marshal's talking about a new start for the town. You've given us a chance to make things right." Isabella stood still for a moment, absorbing the words. "It's not over yet," she said softly, glancing at Wyatt, "but the first steps have been taken." Wyatt met her gaze briefly, then looked back at the woman. "What's the word in town?" The woman stepped farther inside, her nervousness melting a little. "People are talking. The marshal's ready to make amends, and it sounds like he's serious about it. He's already started helping the sheriff clean up the mess the baron left behind." Isabella's heart clenched. "And the others?" she asked, her voice low. "The ones who were loyal to the baron?" "They're being rounded up," the woman replied, her expression tight but resolute. "They won't be causing trouble anymore." Isabella nodded, a quiet satisfaction settling into her bones. They had won. The darkness that had hovered over the town for so long was beginning to lift, and although it had cost them dearly, the seeds of something better were beginning to take root. Later that afternoon, as the sun lowered in the sky, Wyatt and Isabella found themselves standing side by side in the open space behind the homestead. The storm had passed, leaving behind a crisp, clear sky full of stars. The stillness was almost unnerving, but comforting at the same time. Isabella was quiet for a long time, her eyes tracing the lines of the mountains in the distance. Finally, her voice broke the silence. "You know, I always thought that once I had the chance to take back what was mine, things would, well, they'd feel different. Lighter, maybe." Wyatt glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "But it doesn't feel that way, does it?" "No," she said, shaking her head softly. It's heavier, the weight of it all. The choices, the blood, the legacy I've been carrying. I thought I could outrun it, but I can't. He nodded slowly, his voice rough as he spoke. We don't get to outrun the past, but we can choose how we face it. Isabella turned to him, her heart pounding in her chest. And what if I'm not sure how to face it? Wyatt's gaze softened, his hands resting on his hips as he studied her. Then we take it one step at a time, together. Her eyes searched his face, the familiar comfort of his presence giving her a moment of peace. She didn't have all the answers, not by a long shot, but for the first time in a long time she was willing to try. I still have a lot of work to do, she said softly, her voice steady despite the uncertainty. Not just for my family's honor, but for myself. For the future we can make out of what's been left behind. Wyatt gave a small nod. We'll figure it out. He stepped forward, and for the first time, Isabella allowed herself to lean into the warmth of his embrace. It was quiet between them, but there was a mutual understanding. An unspoken bond formed, not just by the battles they'd fought, but by the quiet moments they'd shared since then. The world outside was still a wild, unforgiving place, but in that moment, beneath the vast, starry sky, there was something real between them, a promise of redemption, of healing, and perhaps, in time, of love. Isabella pulled back slightly, meeting Wyatt's eyes. You think we have a chance? A real chance to start over? Wyatt's eyes were steady, filled with a quiet strength that was more reassuring than any words could be. We've already started, Isabella. The rest is just up to us. The stars above them seemed to shine a little brighter as they stood together, side by side, with nothing but the future ahead and a world to rebuild. And for the first time in a long while, Isabella believed that maybe, just maybe, there was hope for what came next. The first rays of sunlight kissed the ridge, spilling across the plain like liquid gold. The wind whipped around them, wild and free, carrying with it the scent of earth and sagebrush. Isabella and Wyatt stood side by side, their horses tethered to a nearby rock, as they gazed out over the sweeping landscape before them. It had been a long journey, one filled with battles, loss, and moments of doubt. But as the sun rose higher, casting the world in warmth and light, Isabella felt a shift deep within her. The weight of her past, the burden of the locket, no longer felt as heavy. The horizon stretched out before them, vast and open, full of possibility. Wyatt, standing tall beside her, broke the silence first. His voice was low, steady, and edged with something soft, something that wasn't there before. Looks like the world's waking up to something new, huh? Isabella turned her head to look at him, a smile tugging at her lips. Seems that way. Her eyes softened as she took in his weathered face, the lines of hard-earned wisdom etched deep into his skin. He'd been through so much, just like her. But standing here now, with the promise of a new day before them, she felt something unspoken pass between them. The past with all its heartache had been left behind. Wyatt glanced at her, his lips quirking into that familiar half-smile. You've been quiet since we made camp last night. You all right? Isabella's smile faded slightly, but there was no sorrow in her gaze, only resolve. I'm better than I've been in a long while, she said, her voice soft but sure. I was thinking about everything we've been through, and how much has changed. The locket, it used to remind me of the things I couldn't escape, but now she reached into her coat and pulled it out, her fingers trembling slightly as she opened the delicate locket. The sun gleamed off its surface, and for the first time, Isabella saw it not as a symbol of betrayal, but as a memento, a reminder of how far they'd come. Wyatt's eyes softened as she gazed at the locket, and he took a step closer, his presence warm against the cool morning air. You've carried that through a lot of storms. She nodded, her voice a whisper. I have. But it doesn't carry the same weight anymore. Slowly, she closed the locket and tucked it away in the pocket of her jacket. The motion was simple, but there was finality in it. She was putting her past to rest. The pain, the anger, all of it. She was ready for what came next. It's time to let go of what it represents, and to hold on to what I've gained. To hold on to you. Wyatt didn't say anything for a moment, but his hand found hers, squeezing it with an unspoken promise. "You've already given me more than I could have asked for," he murmured. "And I'll make sure you never regret it." Isabella felt her heart swell in her chest. She had fought for so long against the shadows of the past, against the weight of legacy, and now she could finally see the light of a future that was hers to build. Their future. "I don't want to carry the weight of anyone's mistakes anymore," she said, her voice steady. "Not mine, not yours. I want to build something new, something that's ours." For the first time, I feel like I can. Wyatt's thumb brushed against her knuckles, his gaze locked on hers. "Then let's build it, Isabella. We'll rebuild our lives, and this town too. I've spent too much time running from what I am. But if there's one thing I've learned, it's that the past doesn't get to decide our future. We do." She nodded, the weight of his words sinking in. They had fought for their place in this world, and now it was time to claim it together. The moment stretched between them, filled with the quiet understanding that only years of hardship and struggle could forge. Isabella turned back to the horizon, the golden light spilling across the land like a blanket, covering everything it touched in warmth and promise. "I don't know what the future holds," she said, her voice low but resolute, "but I know I want to face it with you." Wyatt's response was simple, but it carried the full weight of everything he'd ever felt for her. "Then we face it together." They stood there for a moment longer, taking in the vastness of the world before them, the wind-swept plain stretching to infinity. The world felt as if it were holding its breath, waiting for them to take the next step. A rustling from behind them brought their attention back to the present. Wyatt untied their horses from the rock, his movements smooth and practiced. Isabella did the same, her heart light as she took the reins in her hand. There was no hesitation now, no fear. "Shall we?" Wyatt asked, raising an eyebrow with a teasing glint in his eye. Isabella grinned, her spirit soaring. "After you, cowboy." They mounted their horses, the familiar rhythm of the ride settling in as they took off side by side. The sun had fully risen now, painting the sky in vibrant hues of pink and gold. The land before them was vast and full of possibility, and they were ready to claim it. As they rode off, the sound of their horses' hooves pounding in unison was the only sound that filled the air. They didn't need words to understand each other now. The promise was clear between them, of love, of redemption, and of a future that was theirs to shape. Whatever the world threw at them, they would face it together. The horizon stretched out before them, the endless plains welcoming them like an old friend. And as they rode toward it, side by side, Isabella and Wyatt knew that no matter the challenges, their shared resolve would carry them forward. Into the future, into the unknown, and into a new horizon. The wind picked up, ruffling their hair, and for the first time in what felt like forever, Isabella let herself believe that their future was as bright and boundless as the sky above them. And for the first time, she felt like the weight of the past had truly been left behind,